The following text was written by John Walton, who is a scholar of the Old Testament, as well as a former professor at Wheaton College. He says the Old Testament does communicate to us, and it was written for us and for all humankind. But it was not written to us. It was written to Israel. It is God's revelation of himself to Israel, and secondarily, through Israel, to everyone else. As obvious as this is, we must be aware of the implications of that simple statement. Since it was written to Israel, it is in a language that most of us do not understand, and therefore it requires translation. But the language is not the only aspect that needs to be translated. Language assumes a culture, operates in a culture, serves a culture, and is designed to communicate into the framework of a culture. Consequently, when we read a text written in another language and addressed to another culture, we must translate the culture as well as the language if we hope to understand the text fully. And being a scholar and a professor of Old Testament studies, he's referring to the Old Testament, but I would add that these sentiments also apply for the most part to the so-called New Testament. So in this video, we are going to translate a part of the culture of the writers of the Bible. The Bible was written about 2,000 years ago, and much of it was originally written 3,000 plus years ago. And it was written in a completely different part of the world from where the Western reader resides. It was also written by individuals with a vastly different language and a completely different culture from the Western reader. This creates a considerable disconnect between the writers of the text and the modern westernized reader. This creates what's known as a culture gap. So you have modern westernized people interpreting this ancient Hebrew Eastern text through the lens of their own experiences and cultural norms. This process is known as eisegesis, which involves infusing or inserting your own meanings into the text rather than allowing it to convey its own message. And most people do this inadvertently. Anybody can do this because they want the ancient texts to align with their modern beliefs. Otherwise, they won't feel comfortable with what the text is saying. So the text must congrue with their religious convictions. It must adhere to their established traditions. Otherwise, as far as most people are concerned, the Bible serves no purpose. This video is intended for serious Bible students. It is not for entertainment purposes. It serves as an extensive study that may eventually be turned into a book. A few years ago, I created a thorough video on the same topic, and this new video serves as an update to that previous work. The subject at hand is the practice of men having multiple wives, also known as polygyny. And the Hebrew text is clear that it is permissible. In fact, there's even a law that under certain circumstances requires or mandates that a man is to have multiple wives. And that's a topic that we will delve into in depth during this comprehensive lesson. So as you can see on the screen, part 1, which is what you're listening to now, we will cover where does forced or socially imposed monogamy come from. We will also cover what is the purpose of having multiple wives, because most people have no idea what the purpose of having multiple wives is. We will also cover the topic of whether or not polygyny is sin. We will cover the topic of two becoming one flesh. We will answer the question, what is lust? We're going to talk about what Paul said about multiple wives, if anything. And we're also going to go over the topic of whether or not polygyny was being practiced during what people call New Testament times. In part 2, we're going to cover were Jacob and Abraham tricked into polygyny. We're going to cover the topic of the Lamech argument, or the argument that polygyny started with the bloodline of Cain, started with Lamech, therefore it's evil. We're going to talk about that. We're going to go into the Esau argument. This was a new one for me. We're going to delve deep into that one. We're also going to talk about whether or not polygyny causes problems for marriages. You have people who say that when you read about polygyny in the Bible, it's causing problems. So we're going to discuss that. We're going to go over the Levirate law. We're going to talk about the topic of David taking Saul's wives. And we're going to, of course, cover Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, where it talks about not multiplying wives. We're going to cover that in detail. And then at the end of the video, there'll be some notes about leaving an inheritance when you have multiple wives. Because again, the people who don't understand or don't like polygyny, they're always coming up with something. So one of the things they say is that a man's wife can't be left in inheritance or won't be taken care of if something happens to him, etc., in the case of a man having multiple wives. So we're going to talk about that as well. Recently, both the Israel of God and a former member of the Israel of God have created videos condemning polygyny. However, the Israel of God's presentation was woefully lacking in depth, to the degree that I was not able to even take the video seriously. So we'll be ignoring that, and we will be addressing, or I will be responding in parts of this video to the other individual's video. It's important to note that the beliefs of religious leaders should not be taken as unquestionable truths. Most Israelite elders that I've interacted with accept polygyny as a legitimate form of biblical marriage. In fact, there is even a brother named Elijah Israel, who along with his father runs a church and has a YouTube channel called Israel Teach. And this brother authored an entire book defending polygyny. And he's the same brother that wrote the book called Into Egypt with Ships, a message to the forgotten Israelites. It's a very popular book. And most people would say that this brother's doctrine closely aligns with the Israel of God's doctrine. Yet he understands, and he even wrote a book about the fact that a man having multiple wives is not sin. So one valuable lesson I've learned from my upbringing in the modern Christian church and as the child of a Christian pastor is that it is important to not blindly adhere to or follow religious dogmas. If a particular doctrine lacks clear and coherent scriptural support, it should be reconsidered and potentially discarded. regardless of any long-standing traditions. I've even recently come across information that the pastor of Israel of God advocated for people to take the cootie jab. And I'll post the video in the description box of him doing so. And many of us know that advocating for people to take the cootie jab is extremely problematic. So again, it's essential not to follow any religious leader's doctrine just because they have a big church or a big following. It's also crucial to acknowledge that there are many individuals within the faith who practice polygyny, and to brand them as sinful is bearing false witness against them, because there's no scripture that says that that's a sin. Therefore, it's essential to expose and to rectify these unfounded accusations. And the truth is that some of these men in these religious organizations wish that they could have multiple wives. They actually want to have multiple wives, but they know that it goes against Western societal norms, and they also know that their current or future wife will not allow it. So because of this, some of them resort to demonizing those who are able to have multiple wives because they know they can't do it. And in psychology, this is often referred to as the sour grape syndrome. The fact of the matter is that no one can ever and no one will ever show you a scripture in the Bible that says that a man having multiple wives is sin, even though it was always a part of the culture of the men who wrote the Bible, even though multiple men in the Bible who were considered righteous had multiple wives. Even with all this being the case, it was never said to be a sin, even though there are laws that regulate what a man is supposed to do if he has multiple wives, etc. So for this reason, I recently saw a person try to use the Book of Mormon to demonize a man having multiple wives. Because again, they couldn't use the Bible unless they used some scriptures out of context, because nowhere in the Bible does it say that it's a sin. However, the Book of Mormon is not scripture. So the question arises, why is it that religious leaders are against men having multiple wives? Well, I think Dr. Patricia Dixon touched on a very powerful point, as you see on the screen here. She says, a question that has plagued me is why African American leaders and intellectuals have not taken a stand in support of polygyny. I think the major reason is that most of our leaders are male. Notice how she didn't say men, she said male. Reading on, it says, although many engage in polygynous formations, whether single or married, they have not had the courage to say outright that it is needed and to practice it in a way that is honorable to the women with whom they become involved, or even to themselves. There are, in my opinion, several reasons for this. One is lack of information about the practice of polygyny. Because of this, African American male leaders are not in the position to see through the dishonest and negative propaganda perpetuated about it. The second is fear of losing status, position, and financial support from their white benefactors who also do it, which many eventually lose anyway once their covert practice of polygyny is found out. The third is fear of wrath from feminists. The issue at hand here is that African American male leaders cannot take a stand in support of polygyny without support of African American female feminists / leaders. And I would say that this also applies to many of our church leaders. They understand that the feminists in their churches are not going to stand by them, are not going to support them, are not going to offer financial support, etc., if they start talking about the fact that it's biblically lawful for a man to have multiple wives. So although very lengthy, if this subject interests you, I encourage you to watch the whole video and to also watch part 2 and take notes. It's best not to skip any parts of the video because some segments serve as transitions between different topics, and certain content is essential for understanding later parts of the video. In our modern Western society, a man having more than one wife is viewed as being abnormal and strange. However, the Bible is an ancient Eastern book. Some will say Middle Eastern, some will say Near Eastern, but I'm just going to say Eastern. And the ethics and the culture of the people who wrote the Bible was completely disparate from the ethics and the culture of the people of the Western world today. So they knew nothing of your belief that a man having more than one wife is strange or is abnormal. Not only that, but throughout world history, there have been far more societies that accepted a man having more than one wife as being normal than there have been societies that outlawed it or that had a strict monogamy only rule. So the fact of the matter is that the reason why people like me have to make these types of videos to explain a man having more than one wife is because we live in Western society. But the truth is that the monogamy rule is what needs explanation, not polygyny. Because a man having more than one wife is more normal when we're speaking about world history. It's more normal than there being a strict monogamy, socially imposed monogamy, forced monogamy rule. As it says here, it says out of 1,231 societies noted in the Ethnographic Atlas Code Book, derived from American anthropologist George P. Murdoch's Ethnographic Atlas, which recorded the marital composition of societies from 1960 to 1980, 186 of those societies were monogamous. 453 had occasional polygamy. 588 had more frequent polygamy, and 4 had polyandry. And for those who don't know, when it says polygamy, in general, that refers to polygyny, because as the word polygamy has been used throughout history, it typically referred to polygyny because that is the most common form of polygamy. It even just specified polyandry at the end, and it just told you that there were only 4 societies that had polyandry. So when it's speaking about polygamy, it's talking about polygyny, which is a man having more than one wife. So again, polygyny doesn't need explanation because it is the norm. What we need to explain is why there is a monogamy only rule here in the Western world. Let's take a look here to see where this concept of socially imposed or forced monogamy comes from. As it says here, marriage in ancient Rome. It says marriage in ancient Rome was a fundamental institution of society and was used by Romans primarily as a tool for interfamilial alliances. Roman marriage was a monogamous institution. Roman citizens could have only one spouse at a time, but were allowed to divorce and remarry. And down here it says conventions of Roman marriage. Marriage in ancient Rome was a strictly monogamous institution. Under Roman law, a Roman citizen, whether male or female, could have only one spouse at a time. The practice of monogamy distinguished the Greeks and Romans from ancient civilizations in which elite males typically had multiple wives. Walter Skeetel believes that Greco-Roman monogamy may have arisen from the relative egalitarianism of the democratic and republican political systems of the city-states. The aspect of monogamous institution was later embraced by early Christianity. So that's Roman Christianity. They took on that doctrine of socially imposed monogamy. It says, which in turn perpetuated it as an ideal in later Western culture. So that's where you get your Western belief that a man should only have one wife. It says in the early 5th century, Augustine referred to it as a Roman custom. And that's the so-called church father, Augustine. He said that it's a Roman custom because it is. And again, what am I referring to? I'm referring to forced or socially imposed monogamy. And as it also says up here, it says Roman citizens could have only one spouse at a time, but were allowed to divorce and remarry. What does that sound like? That sounds like our modern Roman culture that we have today in the Western world. Here we have this study called The Puzzle of Monogamous Marriage. We're going to go to the introduction and see what it says. It says approximately 85% of societies in the anthropological record permit men to marry multiple wives. So as you can see, throughout most of history, polygyny was considered normal. But continuing on, it says taking wives is always positively associated with status, wealth, or nobility, even among highly egalitarian foraging societies. After the origins of agriculture, as human societies grew in size, complexity, and inequality, levels of polygynous marriage intensified, reaching extremes in the earliest empires whose rulers assembled immense harems. Today, however, with absolute wealth gaps greater than any seen in human history, monogamous marriage is both normative and legally enforced in most of the world's highly developed countries. So I'm going to read that again. It says, today, however, with absolute wealth gaps greater than any seen in human history, monogamous marriage is both normative and legally enforced in most of the world's highly developed countries. And in this video, I'm going to further expound on why that is. Why, now that we have the largest wealth gaps, why they are mandating that people be monogamous. But continuing on, it says, while the roots of the package of norms and institutions that constitute modern marriage can be traced back to classical Greece and Rome, that's where this comes from, Greece and Rome, the global spread of this peculiar marriage system has occurred only in recent centuries, as other societies sought to emulate the West, with laws prohibiting polygyny arriving in 1880 in Japan, 1953 in China, 1955 in India, and 1963 in Nepal. Given its historical rarity and apparent ill fit with much of our evolved psychology, why has this marriage package spread so successfully? Historically, the emergence of monogamous marriage is particularly puzzling since the very men who most benefit from polygynous marriage, wealthy aristocrats, are often those most influential in setting norms and shaping laws. Yet here we are. In other words, why is it that socially imposed forced monogamy has spread so successfully? Because of Western culture, even though these men who are in power are the ones who are setting and creating our laws. And typically they're the ones who benefit most from polygyny. We're going to expound on that. Walter Skeetel, an Austrian historian who teaches ancient history at Stanford University and is said to be the world's most cited Roman historian in an active faculty position, says the following. To a modern Western audience, the fact that ancient Greeks and Romans were not supposed to be married to more than one person at any given time, nor even to cohabit with others alongside legal spouses, must seem perfectly normal. So yes, a modern Western person would think that. He goes on to say, this may explain why this practice has received hardly any attention from historians of the classical world. Yet from a global, cross-cultural perspective, there is nothing normal or unremarkable about this. Instead, until very recently, polygynous arrangements of marriage or cohabitation were the norm in world history, and strict monogamy remained an exception. Barely 1 in 6 of the 1,195 societies surveyed in the largest anthropological dataset have been classified as monogamous, while polygyny was frequently considered the preferred choice, even if it failed to be common in practice. Although the nature of the evidence does not allow us to rule out the existence of strictly monogamous systems prior to the first millennium BCE. So he says the nature of the evidence we have doesn't allow us to 100% say that before the Romans and the Greeks, there never existed a strictly monogamous society, or that prior to the first millennium BCE, there never existed a strictly monogamous society. He continues on to say, the earliest unequivocal documentation originates from the archaic Greek and early Roman periods. So what he's saying is that according to the history that we have, unequivocally, we could say the earliest documentation of this goes back to the Greeks and the Romans. And then he says, thus, even though Greeks and Romans need not have been the first cultures to prescribe monogamy, these are the earliest securely attested cases, and moreover establish a paradigm for subsequent periods that eventually attained global dominance. He's saying that that's where we got this from. We got strict monogamy. Monogamy as a rule, forced monogamy, socially imposed monogamy. We got it from the Greeks and the Romans. And those are the earliest societies that we know of that had strictly monogamous societies, the Greeks and the Romans. That's what he's explaining to you here. So remember I said that we would discuss why this would be, that although wealthy men benefit most from polygyny, why it would be that nowadays, even though the wealth gap, generally speaking, has become larger, why it would be that these wealthy men are the ones who are promoting and causing the legislation of laws that prohibit polygyny. Why would that be? Well, this talks about it. This is a scholar in the area of polygyny named Hondo Solomon, and he's speaking about, or he's referencing, what we just read, what Walter Skeetel just explained to us. He's talking about Walter Skeetel's writings in regards to polygyny. He says Skeeter's prescriptive monogamy illustrates a well-measured, protracted, and brutal war tactic used by elite families to severely limit the public's material wealth building potential and decrease the psycho-emotional health of its members. They understand the primacy of blood and kindred, which explains why their patriarchs maintain a host of women and children who are financed and kept hidden from public view and given surnames to conceal their identity. By strategically placing them around the world in top-tier universities and providing them allowances until they reach adulthood, the children begin their lives far ahead of the rank and file of young men and women who reside among the general populace. The latter group is thus left struggling to gain that measure of economic power the former group enjoys in full due to their polygamous tactics. In other words, he's saying that many men of power practice polygyny in secret. And if you know anything about the men who are in power, such as the international bankers, etc., then you know that this is true. This way, they are able to have more descendants who they can place in strategic positions of power, and they can all work together as a family unit to dominate. While you and your one wife and your 2 to 3 children are struggling. They have many children, many women, and they're able to work together and dominate you. If I wanted my children to be in government and I had 30 children, hypothetically speaking, and 10 wives, hypothetically speaking, and if my children were in strategic places within the government, some of them were senators, some of them were governors, we would have far more control and far more influence on our society, on our city, on our state, on the corporations in our city, in our state, than you would with one wife and 2 to 3 children. That should just be common sense. This is a quote from Dr. Patricia Dixon in her book called "We Want for Our Sisters What We Want for Ourselves: African American Women Who Practice Polygyny by Consent," on page 43 in my version, which is the Kindle version. It says, monogamy is the only form of marriage that is socially accepted and morally sanctioned in the United States and most of the world. However, polygyny was also widely accepted and practiced throughout the world. It was not until the 15th century, with European world conquests and domination, that the idea of polygyny as an inferior marriage practice and monogamy as the superior marriage practice came to dominate the world. So again, if you haven't comprehended it by now, it comes from the Europeans. It's Greek, it's Roman, it's Western culture. She says early Western scholars played a significant role in this, and Christian theologians provided moral sanction. So of course, Roman Western Christianity, they said this is a part of our doctrine as well. And here's another quote from the same woman and the same book. And again, Dr. Patricia Dixon is a scholar in the subject of polygyny. It says, a unique feature of divine marriage is that a man may marry more than one wife. Such a practice was acceptable among the ancient Hebrew Israelites. However, centuries of contact with various Christian European nations, and then it says Romans banned polygyny in AD 285 and again in AD 393. It says affected a gradual movement away from polygyny among the Jews. So again, she's just letting you know, as it says here, that this was a common practice amongst the ancient Israelites, but because of contact with European nations and the fact that Romans banned polygyny in around the 3rd and 4th century, there was a movement away from the ancient practice or the ancient culture of polygyny that was a part of the Hebrew Israelite culture. Here's another quote from Dr. Patricia Dixon. She says, although monogamy as an exclusive marriage form is culturally specific to Greek, Roman, and other Euro-descended groups, monogamy as an exclusive marriage form is culturally specific to Greek, Roman, and other Euro-descended groups.
Monogamy as an exclusive marriage form is culturally specific to Greek, Roman, and other Euro-descended groups.
The Bible has been used by Christian theologians to make the case that monogamy is what God intended and other forms of marriage, namely polygyny, are contrary to God's will. This man by the name of Augustine of Hippo, who the modern Christian church considers to be a church father, wrote the following to a man named Faustus after Faustus implied that the biblical patriarchs sinned by having multiple wives. Keep in mind that Augustine of Hippo lived in Roman North Africa. He lived in Roman society. He says, again, Jacob, the son of Isaac, is charged with having committed a great crime because he had 4 wives. But here, there is no ground for a criminal accusation. For a plurality of wives was no crime when it was the custom. And it is a crime now because it is no longer the custom. So you see here, he understands that the custom, the culture of the Hebrews was different from Roman culture. So he said in their culture, in their custom, it was not a crime. But in our society, in our custom, it is a crime. And what society is he talking about? Roman. So continuing on, he says there are sins against nature and sins against custom and sins against the laws. In which then of these senses did Jacob sin in having a plurality of wives? It says, as regards to nature, he used the women not for sensual gratification, but for the procreation of children. For custom, this was the common practice at that time in those countries. So again, he said this was their culture. This is Israelite culture. He says, and for the laws, watch this, no prohibition existed. So again, in Hebrew culture, in the Torah, there is no prohibition against polygyny or a man having multiple wives. In fact, there's actually a law that requires men to have more than one wife in some cases. But it says the only reason of it being a crime now to do this is because custom and the laws forbid it. And he's talking about the laws of Rome. Their custom and their laws forbid it. So as you can see, even Augustine, who was born and raised in Roman North Africa, admits that the only reason for him viewing polygyny as a crime is because it is against Roman customs and laws. I won't go into too much detail here because I've already been over this in other videos, but I thought that it was worth mentioning that the reason why the Roman doctrine of socially imposed monogamy is so prevalent in our society today is because this is modern day Rome. As it says here in Revelation chapter 17, the Apostle John is saying in verse 3 that he saw a woman sitting on a scarlet colored beast. So this woman is sitting on this beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns. Then he goes on to explain a little bit more. And in verse 5, he says that this woman is Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. All right, this beast is the home of Mystery Babylon the Great. Here in verse 9 of the same chapter, he says, and here's the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. So again, the woman is sitting on 7 mountains. What are these 7 mountains? They are known as the 7 hills of Rome. And many of you already know this, but again, I just thought it was worth mentioning briefly. It's the same beast that's mentioned here in Revelation chapter 12 when it talks about Christ being born. It talks about the woman who is Israel birthing Christ. Of course, Christ was birthed physically through his mother Mary. Then it says in verse 4, it says, and his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven and did cast them down to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. So again, the beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. It's the same beast. And it wanted to devour the child, it wanted to kill Christ. And who tried to kill Christ? That would be the Romans, or more specifically, Herod, who was the Roman appointed ruler of Judea. In fact, here in verse 7, it talks about the 4th beast. It says that the 4th beast was diverse from all the other beasts that were before it. And of course, it had 10 horns. And the reason why this 4th beast is diverse from all the other beasts before it is because, as it says here in Revelation chapter 13, and again, it's talking about the same beast, it explains that in verse 2, it says, the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion, etc. And these are describing the previous beasts. If you read Daniel chapter 7, you'll see that the leopard, the bear, the lion, these describe the 3 previous kingdoms, which were Babylon, Persia, as well as the Greeks. So this 4th beast is a combination of sorts of all of the previous beasts. And again, this 4th beast is Rome. Even when you read about who put the so-called blacks into slavery, you read about the papal bull Dum Diversus, and that it was Pope Nicholas V. I'll read a little bit of this. It says, issued the papal bull Dum Diversus on 18th of June, 1452. It authorized Alfonso V of Portugal to reduce any Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers to perpetual slavery. It says this facilitated the Portuguese slave trade from West Africa. So again, it is the Romans. It was the Roman Pope who gave authority or permission to the Europeans to colonize and enslave the other nations of people, including taking the so-called blacks from Africa and enslaving them. So we are still under Roman rulership, Roman authority. The mother church is still the Roman church. And this is where this doctrine comes from. This view of marriage that it has to be monogamous only. It's a Roman doctrine. This is why if you were to go on the street in most cities of the United States and do a survey and just ask the general public, what do they think about a man having multiple wives? The majority of them, even though they've had sex with various people, even though they think it's normal to go dating various people and having sex with them, the majority of them will tell you that that's strange or that that's abnormal or weird. Yet, if you ask these same people, what do they think about same-sex marriage or homosexuality, they'll tell you that that's absolutely fine. It was socially acceptable for a free-born Roman to have sex with a woman or a man assuming a dominant role. So as long as he's the penetrator, that's socially acceptable, even if he's having quote-unquote sex with a man. It says both women and young men were perceived as natural objects of desire. Outside of marriage, a man could have sex with slaves, prostitutes who were usually slaves, and the so-called infamous, the restricted man. It did not matter with which gender the Roman indulged in until he did not exceed social norms. So as you can see here, homosexuality was accepted in Rome to a very good degree, more specifically, pederasty. As it says here, it says homosexuality in ancient Rome. It says it was expected and socially acceptable for a free-born Roman man to want sex with both female and male partners, as long as he took the penetrative role. The morality of the behavior depended on the social standing of the partner, not gender per se. So now let's talk a little bit about what is the purpose of polygyny. Because I know that the small-minded Westerner, when they hear about polygyny, all they think about is that a man is having sex with more than one woman. And they also have ideas in their mind about, oh, maybe they're having group sex and things like that. But biblical polygyny doesn't work that way. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in this video. But what is the purpose of polygyny? Now, we've already been over the fact that if somebody has a large polygynous family, and if they have, let's say, their own business, and they have 5 wives, everyone's working together for their business, everyone in unison, that business has a higher potential to succeed. And we're going to go into more details. If I had 30 children, and I had children that were in the House of Representatives, and I had children that were in the Senate, and I had children that were governors, and I had children that were in the FBI, or that were police officers, etc. I obviously have a better chance than the next man who has 1 wife and 2 to 3 children. I have a better chance than he does at generational success. I can leave a bigger mark on my society. I have more influence on my society. And the powers that be understand this, and that is why they want you to have a 1 man, 1 woman, 2 to 3 children family. And you're barely even raising your children because you're at work all day, and the public school system is raising your children and indoctrinating them the way they want them to be indoctrinated. That's the way your family's going to be. No power whatsoever. But if you had a large polygynous family, there's more potential for autonomy. There's more potential for some of your wives to be stay-at-home wives and teach the children, homeschool. So for those who want more autonomy, for those who want to homeschool their children, for those who want to grow their own food, for those who want generational businesses or generational wealth, polygyny provides a better potential for that. As you see on the screen here, it says polygyny, marriage in which two or more women share a husband. Sororal polygyny, in which the co-wives are sisters, is often the preferred form because sisters are thought to be more mutually supportive and less argumentative than non-siblings. A typical rule for sororal polygyny is that the eldest girl in a family marries first, and that as they come of age, her younger sisters join her as co-wives. This was a practice in at least 40 Native American cultures during the 19th century. Polygyny has several economic, social, and health advantages over monogamy. In most cultures, women contribute significantly to the wealth of the household and can thus materially benefit from the labor of an additional spouse. So in other words, you have another woman who is helping the family. She's contributing. It says, where mortality rates of men consistently exceed those of women, polygyny can be seen as a resolution to the deficit of males and the surplus of females. And this is definitely the case among so-called black people, especially in Northern America. And I'm about to go over that in a few minutes here. It says, socially, co-wives and their children may accrue enhanced status and prestige as members of a large and therefore inherently prosperous household. In societies that provide no institutionalized role for unmarried women, the status of a co-wife may be preferable to that of a single woman. Polygyny can also have a positive effect on maternal and child health. During postpartum recovery, for instance, co-wives can usually rely upon each other to perform the most strenuous work of the household. By creating opportunities for sexual companionship among the other members of the marriage, polygyny also supports the once common expectation that women will remain sexually abstinent for 2 or more years, beginning in the last months of pregnancy or upon parturition. This practice fosters adequate birth spacing for the mother to recover from the physiological and emotional stresses associated with pregnancy, lactation, and the care of a child. Despite certain advantages to both sexes, polygynous families can be fraught with bickering and sexual jealousy. In order to dampen strife, many groups accord seniority to one wife, usually the first. Marital harmony may be additionally fostered by customs that valorize the institution, restrict polygyny to the sororal form, or, especially in matrilineal cultures, support easy and recrimination-free divorce. So we know that polygyny, just like monogamy, has pros and cons. And with any form of marriage, there are potential benefits and negatives. So just as it says here that marital jealousy or jealousy between the women can be a negative to polygyny, which is true, the competition aspect can also be a healthy competition, which is to say that the wives encourage one another to be better. One wife may see in another wife qualities that she is lacking, and that could potentially encourage her to improve in that aspect. That's why everything has to be done in love and everything has to be done according to Torah.
But the maturity and intelligence piece that you were speaking of is great importance, because you have to be able to get past it. First of all, be able to self-reflect and handle your own, as you come into situations, things become revealed to you. And you have to handle your issues, truly face your issues, to be a productive member of the family. Mm-hmm. Okay? And it's like even things as such as you have to truly be able to be happy. There's a book out that, what I want for myself, I want for my sister, something to that effect. But the bottom line is, I want you to be as happy as I am.
Yes.
I don't want to be the most, certain things like competition have to be, competition is good, but it has to be healthy competition.
Oh, hold on.
Competition is good.
Hold on.
But
Now,
it has
that please, like, define that, because, just to say that competition is good, please, by all means.
No, competition is good because it helps you elevate yourself, and it helps you. If I see something that one of my sisters is doing and doing well, and I know I lack in that area, it's opportunity for me to gain. Doesn't mean I'm trying to become master as you are,
Right.
but I'm trying to be your backup.
Right.
I'm trying to be sufficient and efficient, so that you can feel like, okay, no, this is something I typically do, and I'm distributing the family in this space. But at least I can do it myself, me and we can do it. One, if we have to be done. So competition, it helps you grow, it helps you learn, helps you take on your skills, helps you process, it helps you deal with your own, and we'll say things to each other, say in certain situations that start to become emotional for whatever reason, something going on in the family, and it rubbed me wrong, but you know what, but you're rising to the occasion better than I am. I'm getting your foot, because you know what, I'm gonna get out of my head, or be able to say to yourself, you know what, in this moment, I'm gonna tell you, you're being heavy. Even as an elder doesn't mean I'm not human anymore, but it means I'm growing, and it means that certain situations shouldn't be boom, 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 back behind each other. I should have a situation that arises, and okay, I can do better. And even in that moment, I might have, shown the weakness and fallen and etc. But I have to remedy it, and it can't show its head like that. And then you got to look at how you present. That takes a maturity. How are you presenting things to yourself? Because even particularly when you're talking about more than one, and particularly how we typically Westernize and looking at that, we fall. He loves me. He's loving me.
Yeah. And me only.
And me only. Or he loves me the best.
Yes.
We all have our relationships.
Right.
But there's multiple relationships to be managed. I have to manage me and him.
Right.
Me and Ia. Me and Ia. Me and Ia.
Right.
So it's multiple. It builds, and that interaction. And a lot of times, even it's the salvation piece, because there are things where it would have been a trigger or a stressor. And I was just okay, yeah. Or we can laugh about it. Even the things we may get angry about doesn't mean we never have tension.
Definitely.
But even that tension, we understand. We do a lot of laughter.
Definitely.
Yeah.
The tension piece, though, can't be insurmountable. It can't be. It has to be a teachable moment.
Right.
Even in that tension, you're right here. Okay. And even it can be in correction. You're again.
Yeah.
You're right. So I have to obviously, and again, Baba often says, even with the communication piece, the whole communicate. If I'm trying to communicate something to you and you misunderstand it, I have to own that.
Yes.
Even if I didn't mean it that way, instead of getting defined defensive, I have to say, okay, what am I not conveying? How am I checking myself?
Yes.
So what I say to all that is, it takes maturity to be able to do that. It definitely takes intelligence, and I'm not saying that means you have to have a PhD. I'm saying it takes an intelligence to be able to, be emotionally intelligent, to step back and say, and understand how is this going to impact everything. We do it all the time. How's it going to impact the ones I love, my family, my sanctuary unit, the whole body. So you have to think about that.
Another reason for men to have multiple wives is that in principle, it allows everyone to be involved with legitimate marriage, especially within the so-called Black community. This is the publisher's description of the book we want for our sisters, what we want for ourselves, written by Dr. Patricia Dixon. As it says here, it says, polygyny, the practice of having multiple wives, has existed since ancient times and is still practiced in many countries throughout the world. In this book, Dr. Patricia Dixon argues that the practice is one the African American community should adopt as well. According to Dixon, the concept of monogamy was spread by Christianity and created an unrealistic and romanticized notion of marriage that leaves many women, especially African American women, unfulfilled and unsupported. And she's correct that one of the vehicles that helped spread the idea of forced or socially imposed monogamy is modern Roman Christianity. Continuing on, it says she offers many reasons to support polygyny, most importantly, the shortage of available African American men. Here we have this article called "Where Have All the Black Men Gone?" It says there's a gender imbalance in many African American neighborhoods. Mass incarceration is largely to blame. It says something is demographically amiss in parts of eastern DeKalb County, just outside of Atlanta. In several predominantly African American neighborhoods, there are only about 3 black men for every 5 black women under age 65. That sort of gender imbalance reflects a number of factors, primarily mass incarceration and high mortality, and it's present in hundreds of communities across the country. Nationally, the Census Bureau counts 88 black male adults for every 100 black women, while the ratio for whites is a more equal 97 men for every 100 women. In other words, men have a higher mortality rate, especially so-called black men. So there are not enough men, literally speaking, within the so-called black community for every black woman to have a so-called black husband. That would be impossible. So the so-called black community has to be polygynous, again, in order for everyone in principle to live within legitimate marriage. It says, governing reviewed the latest population estimates for all black adults ages 18 to 64 in census tracts where they total at least 2,000. In those neighborhoods, there were only a median of 81 black men for every 100 black women. The imbalance was greatest in 380 neighborhoods where there were fewer than 2 adult black men for every 3 adult black women under age 65. In contrast to the numbers for adults, census estimates show that nationally, there are marginally more African American boys than girls under age 18.
Years ago, University of Georgia professor Patricia Dixon thought polygamy exploited women. Then she embarked on a study of it.
I mean, I was transformed by the experience.
She spent years living with different polygamous communities, some in the U.S. and some overseas. She was surprised to find it wasn't about men exploiting women.
We think of a man with several wives as a good deal for the man, but you say this is more about the women.
Right. It's female-centered. The women are the ones who are benefiting when they're in a situation.
Well, I would think people would say it's about the men getting more sex with more women.
Not necessarily. It's not about another notch on your belt or anything like that. It really is the women who really promote this idea.
Often, she says, because there's a shortage of men.
But there's no big shortage of males in America.
Oh, yeah, it is, particularly for the African-American community.
Because, she says, of the higher incarceration and murder rates in that community.
Everybody's talking about one man, one woman. Where are they going to come from?
Shalamia is Prince's second wife. When Prince approached his first wife about taking a second wife, she was upset.
I cried, I prayed, I still didn't understand it, but I gave it a chance. I said, I'll give it a chance.
It's not above.
She invited Shalamia into their home, and a relationship developed.
Just got to be friends.
Now, after 30 years, she can't imagine life without her.
I'm older, but she's more like the mother wife. You know, she's the mother sister. She looks out for everything. Johanna, do you have your gloves? Do you have your scarf?
Shalamia cooks breakfast while Johanna sleeps in. Johanna cooks dinner most every night.
Religious leaders say polygamy is immoral.
If they're saying that that's immoral, they're calling the greatest heroes in the Bible they believe in, they're calling them immoral. They're saying that Abraham with his 3 wives was immoral. Jacob had 4 wives. David had 7 known named wives before Bathsheba.
Right now, I'm trying to get my best girlfriend to marry him. Come on aboard.
So I'm someone that really cares about the black community. Been working for my community for a long time now. And one of the things that I have come to the conclusion of, as controversial as it is that in order for every black woman in America to have a black husband, the black community has to pick up polygyny. Doesn't have to be everybody right now, but the truth is the truth. We greatly outnumber our men. They're taking our men by the thousands. And aside from our feelings about it, if we really get to the bottom of it, polygyny will benefit the black community. That's why I bring it up, besides the fact that it's my favorite type of relationship. And almost anything, any concerns you have about a polygynous relationship, you would have those same concerns in a monogamous relationship. And I really need sisters to stop getting so defensive about it and just think about it. Ponder this truth. And even ask yourself, why does it make you feel so angry for someone to even bring up the idea?
For some people who haven't been raised in this particular lifestyle or haven't embraced it, it's hard to understand, no, I wouldn't want anyone to have my man. Okay, fine. In the Western world, look, you don't have multiple marriages, but you have multiple divorces. Look how many people get married and get divorced, like 4 times, even twice.
If you really, really, really understood your job to take care of a man, you wouldn't have any other life for yourself, because they are a 24-hour, 8-day-a-week project. So having a sister wife to share that with is a joy. I don't want to wait on a man hand and foot. I want some help. I don't even want the sister wife for him. I want the sister wife for me.
What's going on? What's going on, y'all? You know, hey, you see the unit in the kitchen. I got my wives working together right here. I got my wife Ruth right here helping the children. Say hey. I got Zion. Say what's up, Zion. What's up? I got my wife Sarah. Say hey, Sarah. Hey, what Bathsheba? My wife Bathsheba. Hello. What about Suzanne? Hey, say hey. Hello. And here go my newly wife right there. Hey, Dawn. Dawn, say hello. Hello. There go my wife Dawn right there. Hey, there go my big girl Grace. Say hey, Grace. We getting it ready for the children. We about to feed the children. Say what's up, Isaac. That's my boy Isaac. That's Otis. Say hey. There goes Samson. Say what's up. Look at Samson. There go my girl Rachel. Say hey. There go my girl Becca. Say hey, Becca. That's my baby. There go my big girl. She been out there playing, so she's sweating. That's Miriam. Then we even got my baby girl Leah right there. Say hey, baby girl. So look, just showing you, we can work in unity. These women ain't in no competition, man. We building a legacy, man. All praise to the Most High.
So again, in principle, for everyone to be in legitimate biblical marriage without all of the confusion that we see today, people have to take up polygyny. As it says here, this is Ola Ura Equiano, who was a victim of the transatlantic slave trade. Within the 18th century, he is what we would call today from the Igbo tribe. This is what he wrote in his autobiography in regards to the Torah. When he came to the Western world, he read the Torah, and this is what he said. He said, I was wonderfully surprised to see the laws and rules of my country written almost exactly here. A circumstance which I believe tended to impress our manners and customs more deeply on my memory. In other words, he said, the laws and rules of the Torah are pretty much exactly the laws and rules of his people, of his homeland. That's what he's telling you. And in his autobiography, he describes those customs. And many of them align with the Torah. I actually have a lesson on that I haven't uploaded to a video. But they align with the Torah. So let's see what he said. By the way, he was an Israelite. Let's see what he said in regards to his people practicing men having multiple wives. And for those who don't know, even today, many, if not most, of the people who are from the so-called Igbo tribe will tell you that they are the descendants of the ancient Israelites. But let's see what Olaudah said. He said, the men, he's speaking about marriage, the men, however, do not preserve the same constancy to their wives which they expect from them, for they indulge in a plurality, though seldom in more than two. So he said the men indulge in having a plurality of wives, though seldom more than two. That's what he just told you. It said their mode of marriage is thus: both parties are usually betrothed when young by their parents, though I have known the males to betroth themselves. So that's what Ulaura Equiano is saying. He wrote this in the 18th century. Again, this has always been a part of Hebrew culture, of African culture. To say that a man having multiple wives is a sin or is wrong is Greek and is Roman. But we're still talking about what is the purpose of polygyny. As it says here, it says, where in her study of approximately 6,600 Yoruba women, for those who don't know, Yoruba women are women who predominantly live today in West Africa, Hebraic women. It says she found that they perceive many advantages to being in polygyny. These include help with housework, child care, and husband care, including help with providing their husband's sexual needs, companionship from the wives, economics, and other contributions that wives make to the welfare and well-being of the family. So again, more people working together is how you are able to build an empire, how you're able to more efficiently build a legacy for your descendants, whether it be companionship from other wives, whether it be related to economics, the contribution of the other wives to the economics, to taking care of children. If one wife, for example, has to go on a trip or has to go away for whatever reason, she can rest assured that her children are being taken care of. It says, in Africa, polygyny was virtually universal and is still prevalent. Of the 297 African societies included in Murdoch's latest sample, polygyny was permitted in various forms in all but 13 societies, or 5%. Only 2 sub-Saharan African societies did not practice polygyny. The other 11 societies in which polygyny was not found were in North Africa. Other areas of the world in which polygyny has been permitted or was culturally endorsed among indigenous peoples before European conquest and domination include North America, including Mexico and Canada, South America, Central America, the Caribbean, the Near and Middle East, East Asia, Greenland, Australia, Indonesia, Polynesia, the Philippines, and New Zealand. Only in Europe was polygyny rarely found. So again, as you see here, polygyny is more common and has been more common than the monogamy rule. So it's not polygyny that is the aberration or the abnormality or the rarity, but it is monogamy, and it is monogamy that should be explained, or the monogamy rule that needs to be explained, not polygyny. The late renowned European anthropologist Robert Stephen Briefholt wrote the following. It says, as has been already noted, where polygamy is practiced, and when he's referring to polygamy, he's referring to polygyny in this context. He says, where polygamy is practiced, the women are the chief supporters of the system and are bitterly opposed to all teaching that inculcates monogamy. It says, an Akikuyu woman speaking to a lady missionary sent the following message to the women of Europe. Tell them two things, she said. One is that we never marry anyone we do not want to, and the other is that we like our husband to have as many wives as possible. In South Africa, if a woman happens to be her husband's only wife, the ladies belonging to more fortunate households call on her to express their sympathy and to commiserate over her miserable and lonely condition. It is very generally at the request and instigation of the women that a man takes other wives. So as I've explained in previous videos, and as it says here in this final sentence, it is very generally at the request and instigation of the women that a man takes other wives. And that's for those who are claiming that polygyny is lust. How is that lust? The women or the wives very often are the ones who may present the idea of taking other wives to their husband in many cases, because they understand the benefits of it and because they are not westernized or not as westernized, and they're not lesbian women. Again, they understand the benefits of polygyny. So that has nothing to do with quote unquote lust, but I have a whole section on lust. He also said the following: among the agricultural populations of Africa, the accession of new wives not only facilitates the work of each, which is to say that bringing in new wives helps the work of each of the wives. It says, but increases the general wealth and well-being of the family, and thus forwards the aims of both the maternal and the derivative mating instincts of the women. So again, we're talking about the benefits of a man having multiple wives. This is not from a Western perspective. He's speaking about populations in Africa and their point of view, their perspective, their mentalities as it pertains to polygyny. He also says that the American Indians laugh at the European for having only one wife, and that for life. Although uncultured races are as a rule very ready to be influenced by and to adopt European moral and social standards, and by the way, when he mentions uncultured races, he's talking about those non-European races, those non-westernized races of people. So he'll refer to black people as uncultured, he'll refer to Native Americans as uncultured, etc. Remember, he is a 19th century European man writing this. He says, although uncultured races are as a rule very ready to be influenced by and to adopt European moral and social standards, they are disposed to look upon European ideas concerning monogamy as the symptom of a peculiar mental deficiency or form of degeneration. In East Africa, the natives are inclined to look down on us Europeans for our monogamy. The Sinhalese regard monogamy as partaking of the nature of bestiality and brutishness. So you're getting a different perspective that's totally disparate, totally foreign to the Western perspective that most of you were raised in. Robert Briefault says, far from polygyny being regarded with reprobation as a manifestation of moral laxity or self-indulgence, or of lack of consideration for the feelings of women, it is everywhere in uncultured societies regarded by men and women as a merit and a sign of worth, as a laudable ideal and even as a moral virtue. He also says the prohibition of polygyny, which was thought natural and to be met with among all nations in a state of refinement, was promulgated for the first time in any part of the world in the Code of Justinian in the 6th century of our era. And Justinian is the Roman Byzantine emperor. And his code included codes or laws from earlier periods of Roman history, for those who don't know. Which is to say that Robert Briefold understands that the prohibition against polygyny is Roman. To quote Dr. Dixon again, she says, 2 reasons why having sister wives is also helpful include how the menstrual cycle and afterbirth are handled in divine marriage. With regard to the menstrual cycle, which the community refers to as the period of inactivity, women are allotted 7 days to refrain from cooking. The Kiefer or community even has a house for women to go to during this time, if they so choose. And she's talking about a particular Hebrew Israelite community here. Although this may seem an antiquated practice, women who go through extreme mood swings and illness during this period may see the benefit of it. With regard to postpartum, women abstain from sexual activities with their husbands for 80 days. And for those who don't know, according to Torah, Leviticus chapter 12, a woman is ceremonially unclean for 80 days if she has a female child. Reading on, it says, during such times, sister wives help with the newborn, assume responsibility for other children and household duties, and provide the needs of the husband. So again, it's teamwork. These are many of the benefits of having multiple wives in one family. So we've been talking about some of the benefits for women when it comes to companionship, when it comes to being encouraged to better themselves, when it comes to help with domestic duties, etc. So let's just talk about briefly a little bit of the benefit for men here. I know that people in our feminist society don't like to talk about how things benefit men. People don't care about men. Speaking about how things benefit men is considered to be hating women. But just briefly, let's speak about this. As this article here says, polygamy is the key to a long life. It says, want to live a little longer? Get a second wife. New research suggests that men from polygamous cultures outlive those from monogamous ones. And by the way, again, when it mentions polygamy here, it's referring to polygyny. Throughout history, when people mention polygamy, typically, not always, but typically, they're speaking specifically about polygyny. But reading on, it says, after accounting for socioeconomic differences, men aged 60 from 140 countries that practice polygamy to varying degrees lived on average 12% longer than men from 49 mostly monogamous nations, says Verpi Luma, an ecologist at the University of Sheffield, UK. Luma presented her findings last week at the International Society for Behavioral Ecology's annual meeting in Ithaca, New York. Rather than a call to polygamy, the research might solve a long-standing puzzle in human biology. Why do men live so long? The article is going to continue to hypothesize and theorize on why it is that men who have multiple wives appear to live longer than men who are in monogamy. But I can just tell you, as an assumption, the men who live in polygyny are probably happier. And as this article also alludes to, if you keep reading, I'm not going to keep reading the whole article, these men also typically have more descendants. And for those who know anything about old people or senior citizens or those who are elderly, a lot of times having many children and grandchildren, more particularly grandchildren, that they can dote on, that they can love, that they can care about, that they can be excited about, helps them to live longer. It says here, considering the close to 50% divorce rate and various relationship, marriage, and family formations that emerge from it, Tiger suggests that United States society is moving in the direction of onogamy. This is a situation in which each will be married to all. In other words, in our society, people have boyfriends and girlfriends that they have sex with. People are married and divorced multiple times. People date multiple people. In fact, the average person that will point the finger at a polygynous man and say he's lustful, that person usually has had sex with multiple people themselves. And they were not even married to those people. That's how twisted our society is. You have people who have had sex with 5, 10, 15, 30, 50 people in their life. Yet they will point the finger at a man who is legitimately married to 3 or 4 women, and they will say that he's lustful, using their religious dogma, their religion. You can't read it in the Bible, but they'll use their religion to say that he's lustful and he's sinful. The guy in the video who comes out of Israel of God said in his YouTube comments, when someone left him a comment that they disagreed with him, this is what he replied to them, as you see on the screen here. Now, as you see here, he says, also, in order to establish doctrine, you need at least 2 to 3 precepts. So in order for multiple wives to be okay, you would need 2 to 3 scriptures in the Bible where it says God allows or gives multiple wives to men. There are not 2 to 3 scriptures saying that, but I read over 5 precepts where God says, commands 1 wife for man. Okay, so let's go over this. He said, in order to establish the doctrine, you 2 to 3 precepts where it says God allows or gives multiple wives to men. However, the reality is that to cause something sin, he would need at least 1 scripture calling it sin, but he does not have that. And we're going to get into some of the arguments that he made. He also either lied or misspoke when he said here, but I read over 5 precepts where God says, commands 1 wife for man. Now notice that he says 1 wife for man, which implies that he's saying all men. He seems to be using the word man in a generic term to say that all men must have 1 wife, which is the premise of his video. His video is teaching that having multiple wives is wrong or is sinful. However, the truth is that nowhere in the Bible is it commanded that every man must have 1 wife. There's also no scripture in the Bible that commands that every man must not have multiple wives. Just like there is no scripture in the Bible that commands that every man must have multiple wives. Generally speaking, men in the Bible have the option to have no wives, to have 1 wife, or to have multiple wives. And the reality is that we have more than 2 or 3 witnesses of biblical patriarchs having more than one wife and it never being called a sin. So this is obvious, but people are acting like they can't read. We also have 2 or 3 witnesses that regulate how certain things should be done in polygynous marriages. And I'm going to show you that in a moment here. So in order to know whether or not a man having multiple wives is sin, we have to know first what the biblical definition of sin is. So what is sin? This is Leviticus chapter 4, verse 2, and it's speaking about sins of ignorance. It says, "Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, if a soul shall sin through ignorance," watch this, "against any of the commandments of the Lord concerning things which ought not to be done." That is what sin is, when you sin against the commandments of the Most High. And right here, it's specifically talking about sins of ignorance. Just like in verse 13, it says, "And if the whole congregation of Israel sin through ignorance, and the thing be hid from the eyes of the assembly, and they have done somewhat against any of the commandments of the Lord concerning things which should not be done, and are guilty," again, it's talking about sins of ignorance. And it says, when they have done somewhat against any of the commandments of the Most High. That's what sin is. Verse 22 of the same chapter says, "When a ruler hath sinned," so it's talking about a ruler, it says, "and done somewhat through ignorance against any of the commandments of the Lord his God concerning things which should not be done, and is guilty." So again, it's talking about sins of ignorance. And what is it? It's when you do something against any of the commandments of the Lord. That's what it says here. That's the biblical definition of sin. Now let's go to Numbers chapter 15, and this is verse 30. So this is not talking about sins of ignorance. This is talking about sins that you do on purpose, presumptuous sins, willful sin. This is number 15:30. It says, "But the soul that doeth aught presumptuously, whether he be born in the land or a stranger, the same reproacheth the Lord, and that soul shall be cut off from among his people, because he hath despised the word of the Lord, and hath broken his commandment. That soul shall utterly be cut off, his iniquity shall be upon him." So he has broken the commandment of Yah. That is sin. And in this case, he did it presumptuously, as it says in verse 30, meaning he did it willfully. So we just read about what sin is when you're sinning ignorantly or when you're sinning on purpose. Either way, it's when you broke the commandments of the Most High. This is 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. It says, "Whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law, for sin is the transgression of the law." So the definition of sin is when you break the Most High's statutes, when you break his laws, when you break his commandments. Romans chapter 7, verse 7 says, "What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin but by the law. For I had not known lust, except the law had said, Thou shalt not covet." So the Apostle Paul here is referring to Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, which is the 10th commandment. And he says that if it wasn't for the law, he would not have known what sin is, because he would not have known lust unless the law had said, "Thou shalt not covet," which again is the 10th commandment. So the law is what tells you what lust is. And the law is what tells you what sin is, because sin is when you break the law. So you can't charge someone or convict someone of a crime when there was never a law against the action in the first place. In other words, it's not a crime. This is Romans chapter 4, verse 15. Paul says, because the law worketh wrath, for where no law is, there is no transgression. Again, if there is not a law that says that a specific action is against the law, or that it's an infraction, then you cannot charge one with a crime or with a sin. Romans chapter 5, verse 13 says, for until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. In other words, we know that law has always existed since the Garden of Eden. And the Apostle Paul here is saying that sin is not imputed, which means sin cannot be counted against someone when there is no law. So the question is, what are the sexual laws? Where can they be found in the Bible? That would be Leviticus chapter 18, Leviticus chapter 20, and Deuteronomy 22, primarily. For the most part, this is where you will find the sexual laws. And nowhere in the sexual laws does it state that a man cannot have more than one wife. It would have been extremely relevant to say that, because during the time that these laws were given, many of the Israelites had multiple wives. I just want to make sure that's clear. So when the Most High gives them their sexual laws, such as the nakedness of thy father or the nakedness of thy mother shalt thou not uncover, she is thy mother, thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of thy father's wife shalt thou not uncover, it is thy father's nakedness. The nakedness of thy sister, the daughter of thy father or daughter of thy mother, whether she be born at home or born abroad, even their nakedness thou shalt not uncover. So when he's giving you these various sexual laws, you can't have sex with your sister, you can't have sex with your mother, you can't have sex with your mother-in-law, etc., etc. You can't have sex with an animal, you can't have sex with someone of the same sex. When he's giving these sexual laws, why does it not say that a man cannot have more than one woman? Why does it not say that when, as I just said, it was very popular, it was very common at this time? It's a part of Hebraic culture. So the Most High should have said, stop doing that. If it was a sin, that's what he would have said. The Most High would have said, stop having multiple wives. Notice how it says here in Leviticus 18, verse 17 and 18, it says, thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter. Neither shalt thou take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness, for they are her near kinswomen. It is wickedness. And then in verse 18, it says, neither shalt thou take a wife to her sister to vex her, to uncover her nakedness beside the other in her lifetime. That means that while one woman is alive, one of your wives, you cannot also marry her blood sister. That's what that's talking about. Why would it specify that instead of just saying you cannot take another woman? If you have a wife, you can't take another woman. Why would it specify you can't take her sister? That would make no sense if having multiple wives was not lawful. So why wouldn't it just say, you shall not take another woman to wife in the lifetime of your wife? Why wouldn't it just say that? Why would it specify that it has to be her sister? And again, this is talking about her biological sister. It's because it was already known that having multiple wives was lawful. You have to remember, this was common. Having multiple wives was a common part of their culture. The Most High would have told them to stop doing it at some point because it kept happening. They kept doing it. It was popular. Some of the most renowned men in all of Scripture had multiple wives, yet nobody was ever told that it was a sin. Being that there is no law saying that a man cannot have multiple wives, and being that it was a part of Hebrew culture, I should end the video right here. I should be able to end the video, and that should be the end of the discussion. But because people are westernized and Americanized and rebellious, they like to take a bunch of scriptures out of context that have nothing to do with the subject and try to spuriously make them be scriptures that are against polygyny. So we're going to have to address it. As I said, the law does not outlaw a man having multiple wives, but it does regulate it. For example, here in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 15 and 16, it starts to talk about the fact that if a man has two wives, that he should make sure that his firstborn son receives the double portion of the firstborn son, regardless of whose son he is, which is to say, regardless of which wife birthed that son. He has to be fair, and if the son is his firstborn, he has to receive that double portion. He can't say, well, this woman is not my favorite wife, so I'm not going to give her son the double portion. He can't do that. So this is a regulation of a man having multiple wives. Biblically speaking, men cannot just go around having sex with various women without any responsibility. There's regulations around having multiple wives. So as it says here, if a man have two wives, one beloved and another hated, and they have borne him children, both the beloved and the hated, and if the firstborn son be hers that was hated, then it shall be, when he maketh his sons to inherit that which he hath, that he may not make the son of the beloved firstborn before the son of the hated, which is indeed the firstborn. And then it goes on from there, explaining what I just explained to you. Now, the man in the video tried to say that this verse that says if a man have two wives, he tried to say that it is really supposed to say if a man had, as in past tense, had two wives. In other words, he's trying to twist it so that it's not talking about a man having multiple wives, but it's talking about a man who divorces a woman and then takes another woman, etc. That's how he wants this scripture to read. So again, he twisted this part. But when we look at the various translations, they all say the same thing. If a man has two wives, suppose a man has two wives. If a man has two wives, if a man has two wives, if a man have two wives, if a man has two wives, etc., etc., etc. None of them say had, as in past tense. None of them say had. Have. So in other words, no one knows Hebrew but him. So let's look at the text in Hebrew. This is the Masoretic Hebrew text, where it says, if a man have two wives. Here in the Hebrew, it says, le'ish shete nashim. Le'ish shete nashim. If a man have or has two wives. Now, just so that you can see this, let's copy it. Let's paste it into Google Translate. And what does it say? A man has two wives. So he made that up in order to lie against men having multiple wives. And that's what happens when you're being intellectually dishonest. You don't care about the truth. All you want to do is push your religious agenda. I just want to add an addendum here, because those who hate polygyny, they're always coming up with something new. When it comes to Deuteronomy 21, they will say that when it talks about a man having 2 wives, etc., they will say that, hey, that only applies in the situations of war. That only applies in the instances where there's war. And where they get that from is that above that, it talks about war. It talks about taking a female captive. So they'll say that this is only applying to when you take a female captive. And so that's also why I went here to the New King James Version, because it's more clear in this aspect. What do I mean? It's more clear in this aspect because it has headings for each section. And what you need to understand is that Deuteronomy 21 is not uniform. It's broken into sections. It's talking about different things in different sections of what we call Deuteronomy chapter 21. You have to remember that originally the scrolls were not broken off into Deuteronomy 21, Deuteronomy 22, etc. They were not broken off into chapters that way. So what we call Deuteronomy 21 is really speaking about different things in different sections. For example, it starts off talking about if anyone is found slain lying in the field in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess, and it is not known who killed him, then your elders and your judges shall go out and measure the distance from the slain man to the surrounding cities. All right, it's talking about a completely different subject. And then it ends by saying, so you shall put away the guilt of innocent blood from among you when you do what is right in the sight of the Lord. And then it starts talking about female captives. That's completely different. What does this have to do with female captives of war, prisoners of war, spoils of war? Nothing. It's a different section. It's talking about something different. And then after it talks about the female spoils of war, it talks about if a man has 2 wives and what he is to do in regards to his children receiving his inheritance, which is a different subject. All right, and then it goes into if he has a rebellious child, what he's supposed to do in that situation. Then it talks about if a man has committed a sin deserving of death, and he is put to death and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain overnight on the tree. So it's broken off into different sections. The man in the video contradicted himself because toward the end of his video, and I don't think many people caught it, he stated that polygyny, or multiple wives, I should say, was a law that was added for transgressions. So he admitted that it was permitted in the law. That's what he's saying when he says it was a law that was added for transgressions. He's admitting that it was permitted in the law. But what he's trying to say is that it was added so that people would not be committing fornication, in other words. But earlier in his video, he stated that it was against the law, or that it was a sin. So which one is it? Was it a sin, or was it a law that was added for transgressions? Was it permitted by the law or not permitted by the law? Because when you say that it was a law that was added for transgressions, you're saying that it was permitted by the law. But here in Exodus chapter 21, we're going to read another few scriptures that regulate biblical polygyny. Now you're going to have to pay close attention. This is speaking about a woman who was sold as a maid servant by her father. Verse 8 says, if she please not her master who hath betrothed her to himself. So her master has betrothed her to himself. That means he's going to marry her. He's going to keep her as a wife. It says, if she please him not, then shall he let her be redeemed. To sell her unto a strange nation, he shall have no power, seeing he hath dealt deceitfully with her. Verse 9 says, and if he have betrothed her unto his son, so this is if he have betrothed her unto his son. So instead of betrothing her to himself, he could possibly betroth her to his son. It says he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. And verse 10 says, if he take him another wife, if who take another wife? This is speaking about the master. Because remember, in verse 8, it says that he could have betrothed her to himself. That's what it mentions in verse 8. And then in verse 9, it says he could have betrothed her to his son. So when verse 10 says, if he take him another wife, it's talking about the master. It means if he takes another wife, another woman for himself, or it could be for his son. But either way, that's speaking about two wives. It says another wife. So the master could take this woman as his wife and then take another wife. Or he could give this woman to his son. And then he could give his son another wife. But either way, what it says is her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. In other words, he has to make sure that she has her basic necessities. And again, this is talking about a servant woman, but she's also a wife. So this is still multiple wives. This is polygyny. That's why here in the NLT, the New Living Translation version, which is what's called a dynamic equivalent translation, which means it attempts to give you the meaning of the passage, convey the meaning or the sense of a passage to you. In verse 10, it says, if a man who has married a slave wife takes another wife for himself, he must not neglect the rights of the first wife to food, clothing, and sexual intimacy. So it just told you in verse 10, if a man who has married a slave wife takes another wife for himself. That's what it's talking about. So again, this is another scripture regulating biblical polygyny, regulating when men have multiple wives. There is no scripture that outlaws it. So now let's look at what the definition of adultery is according to the Torah, or according to the Tanakh. And the Tanakh is the law, the prophets, and the writings, which is to say from Genesis all the way until the book of Malachi. We will talk about what Christ said about adultery in the next section, called "To Become One Flesh." So keep that in mind. But first, we need to understand the foundation, which is Torah. And then we can build on that foundation by reading the words of Christ. So again, we're going to set the foundation first by understanding what adultery is according to the Torah. Now, you will never ever see a reference to the physical act of adultery in the Tanakh unless it's referring to a man having sex with another man's wife. So now let me say that again, but let me say that in a different way this time, because it helps some people to understand. So now I'm going to say it from the woman's perspective. You will never ever see a reference to the physical act of adultery in the Tanakh unless it refers to a married woman having sex with a man that is not her husband. So I just said the same thing in two different ways to help you understand. So here in Leviticus chapter 18 and verse 20, it says, moreover, thou shalt not lie carnally with thy neighbor's wife to defile thyself with her. Leviticus 18 is giving you a list of sexual laws. And again, it says that a man cannot have sex with his neighbor's wife or his neighbor's woman. Let's go to Leviticus chapter 20. Verse 10 says, and the man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. So again, this is a man having sex with a woman who is already married. And from the woman's perspective, it's a woman that has a husband having sex with a man that's not her husband, as I already explained. Here in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 22, it says, if a man be found lying with a woman married to an husband, then they shall both of them die, both the man that lay with the woman and the woman, so shalt thou put away evil from Israel. So as it just explained here, if a man has sex with a woman and this woman already has a husband, they both have to be put to death, because that's adultery. That is the definition of adultery. And again, as I said, we're going to build on this foundation when we read the words of Christ. This is Exodus chapter 20, verse 17. And before we read this, I want you to notice that in the verses that we just read, it did not mention whether or not the man was married. I want to make sure that's clear and understood, because the man's marital status does not matter. Remember, Hebrew culture is patriarchal. So the man's marital status is irrelevant in the verses that we just read. Whether or not he's married, he still cannot have sex with another man's wife. And whether or not he's married, it is still permissible for him to take a woman as his wife, as long as the woman is single, as long as the woman is unmarried. I'm going to say that again. Whether or not he's married is irrelevant. He still cannot have sex with another man's wife. Whether or not he's married is irrelevant. He still can take an unmarried woman as his wife. Here in Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, it says, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. And then it goes on to speak about his manservant, his maidservant, etc. Notice how it says, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. And as we know, this is the beginning stage of adultery, when a man wants to covet another man's wife. Notice how it does not say, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's husband. Why does it not say, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's husband? Well, first of all, again, Hebrew culture is patriarchal. So, for the most part, it's speaking to men. And the second reason is because that's not a sin for an unmarried woman to desire another woman's husband. That's not a sin. I'm going to repeat that. It is not a sin for an unmarried woman to desire to be with another woman's husband. That's not a sin according to the scriptures. Why? Because that man is able to take more than one wife lawfully. Nowhere in the scriptures will you read, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's husband. It doesn't exist for the reasons I just stated. So when people use the word polygamy, this is the broad category. This is the umbrella category. As it says here in the definition from Cambridge Dictionary, it says the fact or custom of being married to more than one person at the same time. Now, other forms of plural marriage fall under this category, which are biblically unlawful, such as polyandry, for example, which is defined as the practice of having more than one husband or permanent male sexual partner at the same time. So we know that if a woman has multiple husbands, we know that that's adultery, and we just explained why, according to Torah. This video is not about polyandry or the broad category of polygamy. This video is specifically about a man having multiple wives, which is called polygyny. It's defined as the practice of having more than one wife or permanent female sexual partner at the same time. According to the Bible and according to history, Moses most likely had 2 wives. And we're going to see that here. You're going to have to pay attention to understand this information. As it says here in Exodus chapter 2, starting at verse 16, it says, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. And when they came to Reu their father, he said, how is it that you are come so soon today? And they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and also drew water enough for us, and watered the flock. And he said unto his daughters, and where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him that he may eat bread. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses Zipporah his daughter. So remember, he married Zipporah, who was the daughter of a priest of Midian. This man was a Midianite. As it says here in Genesis 25, we're going to see where the Midianites come from. Verse 1 says, then again Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah. And she bare him Zimron and Jokshan and Medan and Midian and Ishbak and Shua. So Midian is a son of Abraham and Keturah. That's where the Midianites come from. They were not Israelites. Verse 4 says, and the sons of Midian, Ephah and Epher and Hanak and Abidah and Eldah, all these were the children of Keturah. So these are the Midianites. Moses took a Midianite wife named Zipporah. This is Numbers chapter 12, verse 1. It says, and Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. Now, when it says Ethiopian here, in English, the Hebrew word is Cushite, meaning a woman who is a descendant of Cush, a Cushite woman. That's why Miriam and Aaron are speaking against Moses, because not only is this woman not an Israelite, she is also not even a descendant of Abraham. His other wife, Zipporah, she is a descendant of Abraham, as we just read, but this woman is not. When it says Cushite, where do the Cushites come from? This is Genesis chapter 10, verse 6. It says, and the sons of Ham, Cush, and Mizraim, and Put, and Canaan. So Cush is a son of Ham. So this woman is a descendant of Cush. Now, there are some who speculate that Moses' wife Zipporah is the woman who's being called a Cushite. But the fact of the matter is that there is no biblical proof of that. There's nowhere in the Bible where Zipporah is called a Cushite. There's nowhere in the Bible where her father Jethro, also known as Reuel, is called a Cushite. And there's nowhere in the Bible where their other relatives are called Cushites. And we're going to look at that in a moment. Now, according to historians such as Josephus, who was a first century Israelite historian and scholar of Israelite history, according to Josephus, the name of Moses' other wife was Tharbis. As it says here, it says, a strange chapter of Moses' life deals with his two wives, a situation that sparked the events of Numbers chapter 12. It says the story begins sometime during the first 40-year period of his life, during the time before he fled to Midian. The Jewish historian Josephus records that as a general of Egypt, Moses was sent with an army to turn back an Ethiopian incursion into Egypt. Having done that in a decisive battle, he took the offensive, gaining victory after victory. Finally, he laid siege to their royal city, Saba. Now we know that most of Moses' life, or what he did while he was living in Egypt and in the Egyptian royal house, we are not told of in the scriptures. But continuing on, it says, because Saba was highly fortified and situated on an island, it was nearly impregnable. And this worried Moses. However, before a long siege could reduce both morale and his army's strength, the Ethiopians offered him a deal, Josephus writes. Tharbis was the daughter of the king of the Ethiopians. She happened to see Moses as he led the army near the walls and fought with great courage. And admiring the subtlety of his undertakings and believing him to be the author of the Egyptian success, she fell deeply in love with him, and upon the prevalence of that passion, sent to him the most faithful of all her servants to discourse with him about their marriage. He thereupon accepted the offer on condition she would procure the delivering up of the city, and gave her the assurance of an oath to take her to his wife, and that when he had once taken possession of the city, he would not break his oath to her. No sooner was the agreement made, but it took effect immediately. And when Moses had cut off the Ethiopians, he gave thanks to God and consummated his marriage and led the Egyptians back to their own land. Several years later, Moses fled from Egypt after killing the Egyptian. He was a fugitive, a wanted man. His Ethiopian wife, no longer in favor among the Egyptians, likely returned to her native land. 40 years passed while Moses led Jethro's flocks, during which he took Zipporah as his wife and fathered 2 sons. Then after the Pharaoh's death, God called Moses to be his prophet and sent him back to Egypt. So let's look at what the father-in-law of Moses and his relatives are called in the Bible. This is Exodus chapter 18. Verse 1 says, when Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel his people, and that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. And then it goes on from there, but notice how Reuel, who we just read about, is being called Jethro here. Okay, so he's called Reuel and he's called Jethro, and he's also called Raguel in English, in your English KJV Bible. Here in Jeremiah chapter 35, verse 1, it says, the word which came unto Jeremiah from the Lord in the days of Jehoiakim the son of Josiah king of Judah, saying, go unto the house of the Rechabites. Now, who are the Rechabites? I'm going to explain to you more here in a second. But these are the relatives of Jethro, which is Moses' father-in-law. It says, and speak unto them and bring them into the house of the Lord, into one of the chambers, and give them wine to drink. Then I took Jazaniah, the son of Jeremiah, the son of Habaziniah, and his brethren, and all his sons, and the whole house of the Rechabites. And it goes on to explain how he set wine before them and they refused to drink because they were following the commandments that they were given by their ancestors. Now, the Rechabites here, as I mentioned, are the relatives of Moses' father-in-law. They are living in Judah at this time. They're living in Jerusalem. So let's go to 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 55 here to read a little bit more about these Rechabites. It says, "And the families of the scribes which dwelt at Jabaz, the Tirathites, the Shimeathites, and the Succothites, these are the Kenites that came of Hamath, the father of the house of Rechab." So in this chapter, it's enumerating the people of Judah, the Judites. And it also mentions these people here. As it says here, they are Kenites. And they come from Hamath, the father of the house of Rechab. These are Rechabites, also known as Kenites. We need to pay attention to that. These are not Cushites. They're never called Cushites in the Bible. These are the relatives of Jethro. And again, as I said, this chapter is explaining that they are among the Judites. Let's see how they got among the Judites. This is Judges chapter 1, verse 16. It says, "And the children of the Kenite," Moses' father-in-law. So here you see him being called a Kenite. He's called a Midianite, and he's also called a Kenite. He's never called a Cushite. I just want to make sure that's clear. He's called a Kenite. Just like here it says, these are the Kenites. They are of the house of Rechab. So he's a Kenite. It says Moses' father-in-law went up out of the city of palm trees with the children of Judah into the wilderness of Judah, which lieth in the south of Arad. And they went and dwelt among the people. So they live among the Judites. Let's go to Numbers chapter 10. Starting at verse 29, it says, "And Moses said unto Hobab," and who is Hobab? Hobab is Moses' brother-in-law. He is the son of Reuel / Jethro / Raguel, as it says here. So it says, "And Moses said unto Hobab, the son of Raguel the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law." So you see that? He's called a Midianite. He's called a Kenite. His relatives are the Rechabites. They are never called Cushites. They have nothing to do with the lineage or the bloodline of Cush. It says, "We are journeying into the place of which the Lord said, I will give it you. Come thou with us, and we will do thee good. For the Lord hath spoken good concerning Israel." And he said unto him, "I will not go, but I will depart to my own land and to my kindred." And he said, "Leave us not, I pray thee, for as much as thou knowest how we are to encamp in the wilderness, and thou mayest be to us instead of eyes. And it shall be, if thou go with us, yea, it shall be, that what goodness the Lord shall do unto us, the same will we do unto thee." And he ended up going with Moses as Moses asked. And eventually his relatives ended up being known as the Rechabites, the Kenites, living amongst the children of Judah. As we can observe, none of them are referred to as Cushites. According to both the Bible and historical accounts, Moses had 2 wives. Moreover, it is essential to note that the law of the Most High never deemed it a sin for a man to have multiple wives. Moses, the lawgiver himself, had 2 wives. Some people use the following scripture along with the fact that Adam only had 1 wife for an argument against polygyny or multiple wives. So we're going to address that. As you see here in Genesis chapter 2, starting at verse 23, it says, "And Adam said," not the Most High said, "and Adam said, This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. So this is Adam speaking. He said, therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. So they take the fact that it says they shall be one flesh, and they say that this is indicative of polygyny being a sin. And the reasoning goes that since Adam was given one wife, then that means that all men should only have one wife. And on the surface, this may sound sensible. However, this is an inaccurate analysis of the text, and I'm going to tell you why. Number one, a man having one wife is perfectly lawful according to the scriptures. And so the fact that Adam had one wife does not address the issue of a man having multiple wives. It doesn't address polygyny at all. There are several men in the Bible who were considered righteous who had only one wife. There are also several men in the Bible who were considered righteous who had multiple wives. There are also other men in the scriptures who were considered righteous, and as apparent from the biblical text, they had no wife, which is to say they were unmarried. So if a man has no wife and he remains unmarried, is that a sin? According to this logic, that must be a sin because Adam did not do that. Adam had a wife. So if we have to do everything that Adam did, then every man has to have a wife. Furthermore, what if Adam would have had two wives? Would that make having three wives a sin? You see, this logic does not add up. Adam and Eve also did not eat flesh. As it says here in Genesis 1:29, and God said, behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree, in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat. So their food was from the herbs. Their food was from plants. Their food was from fruit. They did not eat flesh. So does that mean eating meat is also a sin? Because remember, we have to do everything that Adam and Eve did. That's the logic. And we have to continue with this same logic. You can't just use it on multiple wives. You have to use it on everything else as well, or else you're being disingenuous. And there is a popular doctrine, especially amongst Israelites who have strayed away from the faith, that says that eating meat is a sin. And they use this same logic. Even though there is nowhere in the Bible that says that we cannot eat meat. And they'll say things like Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 are not commandments that we must eat meat. Even though nobody ever claimed that we must eat meat. At least nobody that I know of. But the fact of the matter is, Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, it permits us to eat certain meats. So in other words, they use the same reasoning that those who are against multiple wives use. So if any of you claim that having multiple wives is a sin because Adam only had one wife, you'd better not be eating meat. You'd also better be naked. And the reason why you'd better be naked is because right after Adam said that this is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, etc., and that a man shall leave his father and his mother and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Right after that, verse 25 says, and they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. So you'd better be naked and not ashamed. but you're probably not naked. So as you can see, we cannot look at everything that Adam and Eve did and call doing anything different a sin. And the fact of the matter is that a man can be one flesh with more than one woman. Here in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 16, the Apostle Paul says the following: "What? Know ye not that he which is joined to an harlot is one body? For two, saith he, shall be one flesh." This means that sex is what makes two people one flesh. As they join together physically and the man is inside the woman, they become one body. Sex is also a spiritual tying together of two persons. Therefore, a polygynous man is one flesh with each one of his wives respectively. The wives are not married to one another. So the man is one flesh with each one of his respective wives. And I'm going to show you in a few minutes here that on a spiritual level, there are multiple people who are one in the body of Christ. There are multiple people who are one. This is Matthew chapter 19, starting at verse 3. It says, "The Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him, and saying unto him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause?" Now, I have a whole other video on the subject of divorce. And that's what they're asking him about here, about divorce. So I'm not going to explain that entire subject. Again, I have a whole video dedicated to that. I'm just speaking about the subject of multiple wives here. So in verse 4 it says, "And he answered and said unto them, Have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain," meaning two, "shall be one flesh." So first of all, notice here that what Christ is paraphrasing is from Genesis chapter 2, which we already read, which was not a commandment that every man must have one wife. Because if it was a commandment, then every single man would be living in sin, including Paul, John the Baptist, and Christ himself. So it's not saying every man has to have one wife. That's not what it's talking about. That's not the point of what's being said. He's talking about divorce. In verse 3, they asked him about putting away your wife. And then in verse 7, as we're about to read, they're going to ask about the bill of divorce. So that's the subject. So keep in mind the context. The context is important. This is not about multiple wives. This is not about polygyny. This is about divorce. So reading on in verse 6, it says, "Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." So he's talking about divorce. Again, let not man put asunder what the Most High has joined together. That man and that woman. Verse 7 says, "They say unto him, Why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement and to put her away?" So again, this is the context. This is the subject matter. This subject is not about multiple wives. Verse 8 says, "He saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery, and whoso marrieth her which is put away, doth commit adultery." Now, the man in the video tried to twist this part into saying that this has something to do in some form or fashion with saying that a man cannot have multiple wives. But again, as we can see here clearly by reading, and having comprehension, this has nothing to do with multiple wives. This is about divorce. If Christ wanted to go against multiple wives, here in verse 9, he would just say, any man who has a wife and marries another commits adultery, or something to that effect, something similar to that. But he doesn't say anything like that. He says, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and marry another, committeth adultery. Why didn't he just say, whoever marries another woman commits adultery? Because that's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about multiple wives. This is common sense. But someone twisted this scripture. The man in the video twisted this scripture in a ridiculous manner. That's why I'm going over this. We're not slow. We know how to read. He said, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. He did not say, whosoever has a wife and marries another commits adultery. He said, if you put away your wife, except it be for fornication, and then marry another, you're committing adultery. And the reason why it's adultery, as he's explaining in this verse, is because the man is dealing unfaithfully with his first wife by divorcing her unrighteously. And again, I have a whole video on the subject of divorce. That's not what this video is about, so I'm not going to break that down completely here. But the point is, this has nothing to do with multiple wives. This is about divorce. So the man in the video literally just took a verse and a scripture that is about the subject of divorce and twisted it to be about multiple wives. And this is what people who hate multiple wives, who hate polygyny, do. They take scriptures that have nothing to do with the subject and try to use those to erroneously claim that having multiple wives is a sin. And the man also lied on Christ, because Christ never said that it was adultery to marry another woman. He only said that it's adultery if you put away / divorce. Again, I have a video explaining that your wife for reasons other than fornication, and then marry another woman. But the man in the video claimed that that scripture was saying that marrying multiple wives is a sin. So the man lied. As it says here in Malachi chapter 2, verse 14, it says, yet ye say, wherefore? Because the Lord hath been witness between thee and the wife of thy youth, against whom thou hast dealt treacherously. Yet is she thy companion and the wife of thy covenant. So this is speaking about dealing treacherously with the wife of your youth. Dealing wickedly with the wife of your youth. Verse 15 says, and did not he make one, yet had he the residue of the Spirit, and wherefore one, that he may seek a godly seed. So when the man and the woman become one, this is to seek a godly seed, or a righteous seed, righteous children, righteous descendants. It says, therefore take heed to your spirit, and let none deal treacherously against the wife of his youth. For the Lord, the God of Israel, saith that he hateth putting away. So again, this goes back to divorce. When you divorce a woman, you also put her away. So it says, he hateth putting away, for one covereth violence with his garment, saith the Lord of hosts. Therefore take heed to your spirit, that you deal not treacherously, that you deal not wickedly. Again, this is talking about putting away. It's talking about divorce. This has nothing to do with a man having multiple wives. You didn't read that anywhere. And now I'm going to show you how, on a spiritual level, Christ is married to multiple wives. Matthew 25, verses 1 through 13. And I'm just going to tell you now that this scripture is not a scripture that is telling men to have multiple wives. So then why am I reading this scripture? Even though it's not a scripture that I would typically read for this subject, it's because there are people who are saying that on a spiritual level, the Most High or Christ is married to one bride. So I'm going to show you that on a spiritual level, Christ is married to multiple wives. Again, this scripture is not speaking about, or is not a scripture that's telling men to have multiple wives, but it shows that Christ was an ancient Hebrew using a parable that they could understand and that made sense among their culture, because it was a part of their culture. It's Hebrew culture. So this is verse 1. It says, "Then shall the kingdom of heaven be likened unto 10 virgins, which took their lamps and went forth to meet the bridegroom. And 5 of them were wise, and 5 were foolish. They that were foolish took their lamps, and took no oil with them." In other words, the 5 foolish virgins, they were not prepared for the marriage. Verse 4 says, "The wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps." In other words, the wise virgins were prepared for the marriage to this bridegroom. Remember, they're all being married to the same man. Verse 5 says, "While the bridegroom tarried, they all slumbered and slept. And at midnight there was a cry made, Behold, the bridegroom cometh, go you out to meet him." And for those who don't know, the bridegroom represents Christ. Verse 7 says, "Then all those virgins arose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said unto the wise, Give us of your oil, for our lamps are gone out. But the wise answered, saying, Not so, lest there be not enough for us and you. But go you rather to them that sell, and buy for yourselves." In other words, get your own works. Get your own righteousness. We have enough for ourselves. Verse 10 says, "And while they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and they that were ready went in with him to the marriage, and the door was shut." In other words, those who were prepared when Christ returned were those who came into the kingdom. Remember, he's saying that the kingdom of heaven is like this marriage, this polygynous marriage. Verse 11 says, "Afterward came also the other virgins, saying, Lord, Lord, open to us." So it's too late for them. Why is it too late? Because they were not prepared. They should have been getting prepared when they had the opportunity. But now they're shut out of the kingdom. Verse 12 says, "But he answered and said, Verily I say unto you, I know you not. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour wherein the Son of Man cometh." So you don't know the day or the hour that Christ is going to return. So that's what this is talking about. But again, the kingdom of heaven is being likened unto a polygynous marriage. Christ here is being married in a spiritual and in a metaphorical sense to multiple wives. So again, the following scriptures are not scriptures that deal with the subject of a man having multiple wives. These scriptures deal with the spiritual marriage that the Most High and Christ have with the saints. And the reason why I am showing these scriptures is because there are those who will say that, hey, the Most High is only married to one wife, so a man should only have one wife. Well, again, I'm showing you that on a spiritual level, he has more than one wife. This is Jeremiah chapter 3. Starting at verse 1, it says, "They say, if a man put away his wife, and she go from him, and become another man's, shall he return unto her again? Shall not that land be greatly polluted? But thou hast played the harlot with many lovers, yet return again to me, saith the Lord. So we know that from Deuteronomy chapter 24, it explains that when a man puts away his wife and she becomes another man's, meaning when he divorces her, it explains that he can't take her back because that land has been polluted. In a figurative sense, the woman is the earth. She is the land. I talk about that a lot in my videos that I did on the virgin birth. However, he's saying that on a spiritual level, the children of Israel have committed spiritual fornication against the Most High and return to him again. Verse 2 says, lift up thine eyes into the high places and see where thou hast not been lying with. In the ways hast thou sat for them, as the Arabian in the wilderness, and thou hast polluted the land with thy whoredoms and with thy wickedness. And the reason it mentions high places is because that's where the Israelites would go to worship and to reverence false deities and to follow false religion. Verse 3 says, therefore the showers have been withholden, and there hath been no latter rain, and thou hadst a whore's forehead, thou refusest to be ashamed. So Israel is a whore, speaking in a spiritual sense. Israel refused to be ashamed of their spiritual whoredom. Verse 4 says, wilt thou not from this time cry unto me, my father, thou art the guide of my youth? Will he reserve his anger forever? Will he keep it to the end? Behold, thou hast spoken and done evil things as thou couldest. The Lord said also unto me in the days of Josiah the king, hast thou seen that which backsliding Israel hath done? She is gone up upon every high mountain and under every green tree, and there hath played the harlot. So what does that mean? That means Israel, speaking about the northern kingdom, has committed fornication with other religions, other gods, false deities, instead of being faithful to the Most High. And verse 7 says, and I said, after she had done all these things, turn thou unto me. But she returned not, and her treacherous sister Judah saw it. And I saw, when for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a bill of divorce. So in a spiritual sense, he divorced Israel, which is the northern kingdom. And then it says, yet her treacherous sister Judah feared not, but went and played the harlot also. So Judah is his other wife. And Judah went and did the same thing, was spiritually unfaithful to the Most High. That's two wives in a spiritual sense. This is Jeremiah chapter 31, starting at verse 31. It says, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. So again, that's both. Now we know that when all is said and done, Israel is going to be reunited into one. And why will Israel be one? Because we will all be in agreement. We will all be on one accord. Verse 32 said, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was an husband unto them, saith the Lord. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. Notice how that is plural. He said he will put it in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. That's plural. Verse 34 says, and they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord. For they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord, for I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. And pretty much the same thing is said in Hebrews chapter 8. And in verse 12 and 13 here in Hebrews chapter 8, I'm not going to read 8 through 11 for time's sake. It pretty much says the same thing that we just read. But it says here in verse 12, for I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. This is John chapter 17, starting at verse 20. This is Christ speaking to his Father. He's praying. It says, neither pray I for these alone, but for them also which shall believe on me through their word, that they all may be one. So as you can see, this is multiple people being one. He says that they all may be one, as thou, Father, art in me, and I in thee, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me. So this is multiple people being one with Christ and the Father in a spiritual sense. So it's the same thing with a marriage. A man can be one with multiple wives, and they can all be one, because in a spiritual sense, they are in agreement. They are on one accord. That's what this is talking about. Again, this is not a scripture that's speaking about men having multiple wives, but this is a scripture that's showing that on a spiritual level, the Most High and Christ are one with multiple people. Verse 22 says, and the glory which thou gavest me I have given them, that they may be one even as we are one. Again, that's multiple people being one. Christ and his Father being one, and multiple people being one with them. Verse 23 says, I in them and thou in me, that they may be made perfect in one, and that the world may know that thou hast sent me and hast loved them as thou hast loved me. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 12, starting at verse 12. The Apostle Paul says, for as the body is one and hath many members, and all the members of that one body being many are one body, so also is Christ. So there are multiple members in Christ, multiple people that are one. Verse 13 says, for by one Spirit are we all baptized into one body, whether we be Jews or Gentiles, whether we be bond or free, and have been all made to drink into one Spirit. So it's one body. We are all one flesh in a spiritual sense. Why? Because we are all in agreement. We are all in one accord. So what makes you think that a man that hath multiple wives cannot be one in a spiritual sense with all of them? This is verse 14. It says, for the body is not one member, but many. If the foot shall say, because I am not the hand, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? And if the ear shall say, because I am not the eye, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? If the whole body were an eye, where were the hearing? If the whole body were hearing, where were the smelling? So in other words, everyone has their own position and their own role. Every role is important. Every position is important. That's what he's saying here. Verse 18 says, but now God hath set the members, every one of them, in the body, as it hath pleased him. And if they were all one member, where were the body? But now are they many members, yet but one body. And the eye cannot say unto the hand, I have no need of thee, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. So everyone is important. Everyone has their position to play. Everyone has their contribution to make. So to bring it all full circle, Christ in a spiritual sense is one or is married to multiple people. One with you, one with me, one with the brother over there, one with the sister over there. Because we are all a part of the body of Christ. As it says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, starting at verse 15, know you not that your bodies are the members of Christ? That's plural, bodies, multiple members. He says, shall I then take the members of Christ and make them the members of an harlot? God forbid. So we know that we are not to partake in whoredom or fornication, the Hebrew word zanah, which is breaking the sexual laws. As it says in verse 16, what, know ye not that he which is joined to an harlot is one body? So again, a man is one body or one flesh with any woman that he's with, even if she's a whore. That's what the Apostle Paul is saying here. It says, for two, saith he, shall be one flesh. So the polygynous man is one flesh with each of his respective wives. And he can be one in a spiritual sense with multiple women. Just like Christ in a spiritual sense can be one with multiple people. We read in Matthew 25 about the parable. The bridegroom who represents Christ is married to multiple women. And as far as what Christ said about lust, that's discussed in the section on lust. When he said that he that looks on a woman to lust after her commits adultery in his heart, see that section for the breakdown on that and what he was talking about. So I'm going to need you to follow me on this so that you can understand. Here in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27, it says, you have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. When people see lust, see the word lust in the context of a man lusting after a woman, they think of sexual desire. So if we take this scripture at face value, then it would mean that even if a man looks at his own wife with sexual desire, aka lust, then he is committing adultery with her in his heart, which means his mind, because it says woman, and your wife is a woman. So that would mean that virtually no one can ever have sex, because if a man desires his woman sexually, that would be adultery. The Greek word being used here that's translated as woman is the Greek word gune, which is basically the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word isha. And what does it mean? What does this word mean? It means woman, and you can also say wife. For those who don't know, in Hebrew, there is no specific word for wife. It is the word isha in Hebrew, which means woman. But if it's a woman that belongs to a man because she is in the covenant of marriage with a man, then that's his woman, his isha, or we would say his wife. So again, the Greek word being used here that's translated as woman is the Greek word gune. So here it is, the Greek word gune. And as it says here, it's translated as women or wife. There's no difference. It says here, a woman of any age, whether virgin or married or a widow, a wife of a betrothed woman, a woman, especially a wife, woman. So when we're speaking about lust, Lust simply means to desire something that is unlawful, something that you're not supposed to have. So to lust after a woman means to want another man's wife. Remember that for the Hebrews, there is no difference between the word wife and the word woman. As it says here in Exodus 20:17, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, etc., etc., the things that belong to your neighbor. And when it says wife, that's Isha. Don't covet your neighbor's woman. Now, to covet and to lust is the same thing. That's very important to understand. So why is it a sin here in this verse to desire these things? It's because they belong to someone else. That's why. In fact, the word being used in Matthew 5:28, that's translated here as lust, is the Greek word epithemia. And it's the same exact word that the Apostle Paul uses in Romans chapter 7, verse 7. But in that verse, it's translated as covet. Why? Because as I already said, covet and lust is the same thing. To covet and to lust is the same thing. This is Romans chapter 7, verse 7. It says, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin but by the law. For I had not known lust, watch this, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. The word translated as covet here is the Greek word epithemia. And we're going to look at that word in a minute here. It's the Greek word epithemia, and it's translated as covet. The same exact word here is translated as lust. And what is the Apostle Paul talking about? He's talking about the 10th commandment. That's why he said, I had not known sin but by the law, for I had not known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. And where is he getting that from? He's getting that from the 10th commandment. Thou shalt not covet. That's where he's getting this from. And as you see here, it says, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Why? Because she belongs to someone else. And again, the same word Paul used is the same word Christ is using here. That's translated as lust. So Paul is referring to the 10th commandment, which says not to covet, and we can say / lust after another man's woman or wife. The word really just means to desire, but when you are desiring something unlawfully, we will call it lust. There's nowhere in the Bible where having multiple wives is said to be a sin, so desiring multiple wives is not lust. The Hebrew word that's used in the 10th commandment that's translated as covet is the Hebrew word kamad. That's the Hebrew word being used here. Kamad. This is the Hebrew word being used, kamad, and it means to desire. But when used in a negative context, it means to covet, or we could say lust. Hopefully you can understand that. Here it says, to delight in, beauty, greatly beloved, covet, delectable thing, delight, desire, goodly, lust, pleasant, precious thing. So again, it just means to desire, but in a negative context, it means to lust or to covet. That's the Hebrew word being used in Exodus chapter 20, verse 17 for the 10th commandment. Here is the Greek word that Christ and the Apostle Paul used. In Matthew 5:28, it says lust in English. In Romans 7, verse 7, it says covet in English. But it's actually the Greek word epithemio. And it says here, it's translated as desire, covet, lust, lust after, fame. So again, it just means to desire, but in a negative context, it would mean lust or covetousness. And then it says to turn upon a thing, to have a desire for, long for, to desire, to lust after, covet, of those who seek things forbidden. It says to set the heart upon, i.e., long for, rightfully or otherwise. That means it can be a righteous desire or an unrighteous desire. It just depends on if it's lawful or not. Covet, desire, would, fain, lust after. Apostle Paul in Romans 7:7 says that he would not have known sin but by the law, for he would not have known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. The word for covet is the Greek word epithemio, and he's talking about the 10th commandment. Remember, what we call the New Testament is written in Greek, so that's why this word is Greek. In Hebrew, we already went over what the word is in Hebrew, which is hamad. We already went over that. So that's what he's saying, covet. And that's the same exact word that Christ used here when it says lust. Talking about looking on a woman, or you could say wife, to lust after her. You could say covet. And why is that a sin? Because she already belongs to someone else. That's what we just read here in Exodus chapter 20, verse 17. You shall not covet thy neighbor's wife. Hamad. You see it being used again here in Proverbs chapter 6. In verse 25, it says, lust not after her beauty in thine heart. And that's the same Hebrew word, hamad. You could say covet not after her beauty. Neither let her take thee with her eyelids. And it's going to explain why. It's going to explain more. It says, for by means of a whorish woman, a man is brought to a piece of bread, and the adulteress will hunt for the precious life. So she's an adulteress. She belongs to another man. It's important to understand that. That's why to desire her is lust or covetousness. So that's what Christ is talking about when he's speaking about adultery. And he says that if you look on this woman to covet or to lust after her, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. And as I already said, to lust after a woman is to lust after another man's woman or wife, because you're not supposed to have her, because she's already married. And if Christ was literally saying that it's a sin for a man to desire a woman sexually at all, then it would be a sin for a man to desire his own wife. Because again, this word means desire, this Greek word being used here, epithemio. But in a negative context, we say lust. Just like hamad, covet, this word means desire. But in a negative context, it's covet or lust. If a man's motives were driven by lust, he would engage in sexual relations with women in an unlawful manner, perhaps even resorting to relationships with prostitutes without any intention of assuming responsibility or committing to them as their husband. However, seeking biblically lawful wives with the desire to lead, to love, and to be devoted to them for a lifetime does not fall under the category of lust. Calling polygynous men lustful is highly ignorant and demonstrates a lack of understanding. I'll give you a real life example of why. I have a friend who I teach with who is not from the United States that wants to have a large family with multiple wives. His grandfather also had multiple wives. Now, to call him lustful is absurd and unfounded because he has not had sex in over 5 years and he refuses to have sex until he is properly under a covenant with a woman. He is literally one of the most sexually restrained men that I know. Recently, he's been courting a woman and teaching her about the biblical and Hebraic way of life, and he has refused to have sex with her despite her advances. And this is just one example. I can honestly affirm that some of the polygynous men that I know are some of the most sexually restrained men that I know. But unfortunately, individuals with a narrow, uninformed Western perspective ignorantly label polygyny as lustful because they're ignorant of the true purpose and benefits of polygyny. They literally don't know what polygyny is for. And ironically, some of those who criticize polygyny as lustful have themselves engaged in sexual relations with numerous people, far exceeding the numbers of partners seen in a typical polygynous relationship. In other words, there are many people in the West who have had sex with 20 plus people in their life, and yet they will claim to be monogamous. And these same people who claim to be monogamous, but they've had sex with over 10 and over 20 people, these same people will look down on polygynous men. Say there's a polygynous man with 5 wives. They'll look down on him and call him lustful, even though he's having lawful sex and he may have had far less sex partners than they have. And this all goes back to what it says on the screen here in Ecclesiasticus chapter 3, verse 24, where it says, "For many are deceived by their own vain opinion." When people call polygyny sin, they're using their own vain opinion, because you can't read that in the Bible. And it says, "An evil suspicion hath overthrown their judgment." They have an evil suspicion about polygynous men, and that overthrows their judgment. They're not able to judge righteously because they have an evil suspicion in their mind about men that have multiple wives. So they aren't able to judge righteously concerning the situation, concerning the fact that it's biblical, that it's lawful. They're too blinded by the fact that they see one man with multiple wives, and again, all they can think about is sex, because they don't even know what polygyny is for. They have a Western mind, and they don't even understand the purpose of polygyny. There are many who will use Paul's writings and twist them to make them be against a man having multiple wives. So we're going to address that. As it says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1, it says, "Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." So the first thing that we need to understand is that he said, "Concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." Now, we do not know exactly what they wrote to him. That's very important to keep in mind. But we do have clues of what it may be related to. When we go a few chapters earlier in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 1, it says, "It is reported commonly that there is fornication among you, and such fornication as is not so much as named among the Gentiles, that one should have his father's wife." So Paul is saying that there's fornication among you, that a man would sleep with his father's wife. Now, why is that fornication? For those who don't know, fornication is the Hebrew word zanah, or zununin for plural, which means to break the sexual laws. So it's fornication for a man to have sex with his father's wife. And we know that because the law in Leviticus 18 verse 8 says, the nakedness of thy father's wife shalt thou not uncover. It is thy father's nakedness. So that's why this is fornication. You can read the sexual laws in Leviticus chapter 18, Leviticus chapter 20, and Deuteronomy chapter 22. There are a few other places as well, but you'll find most of them there. When you break those sexual laws, that's fornication. And obviously there's no law against a man having more than one wife. This is something that religious people are making up. And you also have the Hebrew word taznut, which usually refers to spiritual fornication or idolatry. Now, again, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1, just in case you forgot, the Apostle Paul says, now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. So we saw a clue in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 1, where Paul speaks about fornication. Then when we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, we see what he's talking about, because towards the end of the chapter, starting at verse 15 here, actually before this, but this is the part we're going to read. It says, know you not that your bodies are the members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them the members of an harlot? God forbid. So there are multiple people who are a part of the body of Christ. And then he says, what, know you not that he which is joined to a harlot is one body? For two, saith he, shall be one flesh. So that means a man that has sex with a whore is one body with her. Why is that? It's because when a man is inside of a woman, they are one. And it's also a spiritual tying together as well. And there's also a DNA aspect to that as well that I won't get into here. Verse 17 says, but he that is joined unto the Lord is one spirit. So they're all one, meaning they're all in unison. Verse 18 says, flee fornication. Every sin that a man doeth is without the body, but he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body. So again, Paul is talking about breaking the sexual laws. It says in verse 19, what, know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost, which is in you, which you have of God, and you are not your own? For you are bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. So as we can see, and this is the end of the chapter. So as we can see, the chapter ends with Paul speaking about fornication. And since we know that the manuscripts of the so-called New Testament were not originally divided into chapters and verses, and that the chapter and verse division system that we have now was added around the year 1551 by Robert Estienne, also known as Stephanus, as I spoke about in a previous video, who was a French printer and scholar. Since we know that chapters and verses are relatively new to this text, we can see that when it goes to the next chapter, because remember, this is the end of the chapter, when it goes to the next chapter, he's still talking about fornication. So when he says concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it's related to fornication. That's why he said it's good for a man not to touch a woman. You have to understand the context so that you can understand what's going on, what he's talking about. And then in verse 2, he says, nevertheless, to avoid what? Fornication. That's the subject matter. He says to avoid fornication, which is breaking the sexual laws, which is the Hebrew word zana, or the Greek word porneia or pornos. Breaking the sexual laws, he said to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. And so here where it says, let every man have his own wife, Even though Paul is not even talking about the subject of a man having multiple wives or polygyny, some will try to use this out of context and twist it to be speaking about polygyny. And so they will erroneously say that this means a man is supposed to have one wife. But the word translated as own here in this verse has nothing to do with something being one or only. It does not mean only. Here is the Greek word that's being translated as own in 1 Corinthians 7 verse 2, where he says every man have his own wife. It's the Greek word held to, as you see here. It does not mean only. You see, it says himself, themselves. That's plural. Yourselves, plural. Ourselves, plural. It says himself, herself, itself, themselves. This does not mean only. Even when you look at the way the word is used, here it says himself, but here it says yourselves. That's plural. So it does not mean every man have his only wife. But that's the idea you'll get listening to these religious people, these modern Christians. And then some will say, well, brother, how about the fact that it says wife? How about the fact that it says wife here, as in singular, wife? Not wives, but wife. How about that, brother? Well, first of all, again, Paul is not even talking about polygyny here. So, of course, if a man has his own wife, that's not a problem at all. Before you can have a second wife, you have to have a first wife. But I'm going to show you something, since the fact that it says wife here is something that some people want to twist out of context and make it be about rejecting polygyny. Let me show you something. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 33 and 34. It says, and these are they that waited with their children, of the sons of the Kohathites. Who are the Kohathites? Kohath is a son of Levi. All right, so the priests come out of Kohath. Moses was a Kohathite. Aaron was a Kohathite. They were sons of Amram. All right, so these are Levites. It says, of the sons of the Kohathites, Heman, a singer, the son of Joel, the son of Shemuel. Who is this Shemuel? This is Samuel, the prophet. That's who this is talking about, the prophet Samuel. And then it says the son of Elkanah. Who was Samuel's father? Elkanah. Again, these are Levites. And then it says the son of Jeroham, the son of Eliel, the son of Toah. So again, this is talking about the prophet Samuel and his father Elkanah, who were Levites. This is 1 Samuel chapter 1. It says, now there was a certain man of Ramoth Zophim of Mount Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah. That's the father of Samuel. And it says the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu. Notice how those are the same names we just read, because that's who it's talking about. The son of Zuph and Ephrathite. It says, and he had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. So he had 2 wives, right? Yet when we read in verse 4, it says, and when the time was that Elkanah offered, he gave to Peninnah his wife, and to all her sons and her daughters portion. So he gave to Peninnah his wife, singular. This is his wife in the singular. Just because you have a wife doesn't mean that you don't have other wives. So I'm just showing you this to show you that that nonsense about he said wife in 1 Corinthians 7, that has nothing to do with anything. He said wife here. That doesn't mean that he doesn't have any other wives. Because we just read in verse 2 that he had 2 wives. And then in verse 8, it says, then said Elkanah her husband to her. So that's her husband. Speaking to Hannah. She has a husband. Just because and I shouldn't have to go over this. This is actually ridiculous, but I have to because people are twisting scriptures out of context, and silly people are believing what they're saying. So you see here it says Hannah has a husband. Elkanah is her husband. One husband. That doesn't mean that he doesn't have any other wives. This is Genesis chapter 30. This is speaking about Jacob, or who we know as Israel. And he had 4 wives, Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah. It says here in verse 3, and she said, talking about Rachel, behold my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. And she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife. You see that? That's singular. That's singular for those who don't know. To wife. Yet he had other wives. That's singular. In verse 9 it says, when Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah her maid and gave her Jacob to wife. That's singular, even though he had other wives. And again, this is actually silly, but people are being silly with this subject. They're taking things out of context that have nothing to do with anything, and they're trying to make it be scriptures to use against polygyny. This is 2 Samuel chapter 3, talking about David and his wives. It says, now there was long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, but David waxed stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul waxed weaker and weaker. And unto David were sons born in Hebron, and his firstborn was Amnon of Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and his second Chileab of Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite, and the third Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Jeshurun. So as we can see, he had several wives. It says in verse 4, and the fourth Adoniah, the son of Haggith, and the fifth Shephatiah, the son of Abital, and the sixth, watch this, Ephraim, by Eglah, David's wife. So you see that? It's not plural, it's singular. David's wife. Yet he has other wives. It just told you he had other wives, and it's calling her his wife, singular. So Paul using the word wife, singular, has nothing to do with anything. Now back to the original scriptures in question. We see that he said, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. So that's talking about sexual relations, that husbands and wives should have sexual relations. Verse 5 says, defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. In other words, have sexual relations so that you won't be tempted by Satan to have unlawful sexual relations. And then in verse 6 it says, but I speak this by permission and not of commandment. So there you have it. Everything he just said was actually not even a commandment. It was Paul speaking what he thinks is good advice. So people using this to try to twist it to be against polygyny, it has no basis whatsoever. And even if you thought it did have a basis, verse 6 tells you that that's not even a commandment. Now, if we go back to the previous chapter again, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and he was speaking about those who won't make the kingdom, those who are fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, effeminate, etc., etc. He goes on to say in verse 12, all things are lawful unto me, but all things are not expedient. What does that mean? Does that mean that having sex with another man's wife is lawful for Paul? Stealing is lawful for Paul? Murdering is lawful for Paul? Absolutely not. He says, all things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. So again, is breaking the law lawful for Paul? Absolutely not. All Paul is saying is that if something is not against the law, then it's lawful for him to do, but it may not be the best thing to do. That's what he means when he says all things are not expedient. It might not be beneficial just because it's lawful. It might even be a bad habit. That's why he said, I would not be brought under the power of any. Eating junk food, for example, that's a bad habit, but it's lawful. So even if in your mind you think polygyny is bad or a man having multiple wives is bad, and I would say probably you don't understand what its purpose is anyway, even if you think that, the most you could say, the worst you could say, is that it's not expedient in your mind, that it's to you, it's not beneficial. But you cannot call it a sin because there is no law in the Bible that says that it's a sin. This is 1 Timothy chapter 3, starting at verse 1. It says, this is a true saying. If a man desire the office of a bishop, so this is if a man wants to be in this office, in this position, in the ecclesia, if he wants to be a bishop, which is the Greek word episkope, meaning a overseer or bishop in the church. It says he desireth a good work. So remember, this man has to desire this office. This is an office in the church, the ecclesia. Verse 2 says, a bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach. So people will see here where it says the husband of one wife, and they will say that, see, men are only supposed to have one wife. However, Paul did not say that every man must have one wife. Paul is specifically talking about, as he said in verse 1, those who desire the office of a bishop or an overseer, an episkope in Greek. He's speaking about those men. They should be the husband of one wife. You have to remember, Paul did not even have a wife. So he couldn't be saying that every man has to be the husband of one wife. That could not be what he was saying. Also keep in mind that in the verse that we just read, which is 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, where he said they must be the husband of one wife, the Greek word being used there is mia. Keep that in mind. That's going to be relevant in a few minutes here. Here in verse 5 of Titus chapter 1, it says, for this cause left I thee in Crete, that thou shouldest set in order the things that are wanting, and ordain elders in every city, as I had appointed thee. So these are men being ordained and set up in certain positions. Presbyteros is the word in Greek. Presbyteros. Elders or people who have positions of leadership in the church. It says, verse 6, if any be blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of riots or unruly. So again, Paul says they must be blameless. He's speaking about qualities that they should have. And he says the husband of one wife. So remember, Paul is the one that is overseeing all of this. And Paul does not even have a wife. So it wouldn't make sense for him to be saying that every man has to have one wife, because Paul didn't have a wife. And what is the Greek word being used here in verse 6? It's the Greek word mia. All right, so it was mia in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2 that we just read, and it's mia here. What does mia mean? Mia can be translated as one, or it can be translated as first. Now, there's many different opinions about what Paul is actually saying. But when we look in the same letter in chapter 3, this is the same exact letter. In verse 10, It says, a man that is an heretic after the first and second admonition, reject. Paul is saying, reject this heretical man after the first and second admonition. And what word here is being translated as first? That's right. It's the Greek word mia. It's the Greek word mia. You need to understand that. So just like here, where mia is being translated as first, mia could also be translated as first here, which means that the man should still be married to his first wife if he wants this leadership position in the church. However, again, even if you believe that the word one here is the correct translation, and that Paul is saying that these leaders should have one wife, even though he didn't have a wife, even if you go with that, he's still only talking about men who desire and who have these positions in the church, not everyone. If he was speaking about everyone, he would have said all men must be the husband of one wife, or should be the husband of one wife. But he never said that. For those who state that the so-called New Testament doesn't show brothers having multiple wives, what you need to understand, first of all, is that the marital details of the brothers that are mentioned in the New Testament are rarely explained. The second thing that you need to understand is that in the time of what you call the New Testament, they were under Roman authority. And we've already been over the fact that the Romans were not very friendly with polygyny, historically speaking. And you also need to understand that before being under Roman authority, being vassals under the Romans, they were also vassals under the Greeks. And as I've already explained, the Greeks were not very polygyny friendly, which is to say that influence had begun to proliferate itself throughout Hebraic culture. And even with that being the case, many Israelite men still had multiple wives during the time of Christ and during the first few centuries. Even with all of the influence from the Greeks and the Roman culture, it was still a part of Hebraic culture during that time. Just because you don't read about it in what you call the New Testament doesn't mean that it wasn't the case. What you see on the screen is a text written by a man called Flavius Josephus. A little bit about Josephus. His birth name was Joseph ben Matthias, and he was born in 37 AD. And he was well educated in the law. He was well educated in Greek literature, and he was very knowledgeable about Hebraic culture in general, whether it be the Sadducees, whether it be the Pharisees, whether it be the Essenes, etc. He became a priest at 29 years old, and he identified himself with the Pharisees. He also became a general in the Israelite army in Galilee during the time of 66 to 70 AD with the war against Rome, and he surrendered to the Romans. It says his, speaking about Herod, wives were numerous, since polygamy was permitted by Jewish custom, and the king gladly availed himself of the privilege. And when it speaks about Herod, Herod was an Edomite, but Herod followed Hebrew culture. He considered himself a so-called Jew. So as Josephus here says, polygamy was permitted by Jewish custom, and the king gladly availed himself of the privilege. And this is in the first century, during the time where people say that they don't see polygyny in the New Testament. This is during that time period. And here's another example. He says he also caused them to be betrothed against they should come to the proper age of marriage. The elder of Alexander's sons to Pheroras' daughter, and Antipater's daughter to Astribulus's eldest son. He also allotted one of Astribulus's daughters to Antipater's son, and Astribulus's other daughter to Herod, a son of his own, who was born to him by the high priest's daughter. For it is the ancient practice among us to have many wives at the same time. It is the ancient practice among who? Among the Hebrew Israelites. Josephus is an Israelite speaking in the 1st century, during the time where people are claiming that they don't see any polygyny. This is Josephus speaking. Here's another example. This is Philo. This is another Israelite scholar who lived in the 1st century, during the time of the so-called New Testament. And here where it says 207, I'm going to read this paragraph, and keep in mind that he's speaking about, in this context, men who are men of virtue. And he's speaking about the fact that just because they are virtuous men doesn't mean that their children will be. So he says the first was the father of many children, begotten on 3 wives. So he had 3 wives. Not for indulgence in pleasure, but in the hope of multiplying the race. So he says this man wanted to multiply his race. That's why he had 3 wives. And again, that is a large part of the purpose of having multiple wives. You can more efficiently multiply your children. But it says, but of his many sons, only one was appointed to inherit the patrimony. All the rest failed to show sound judgment, and as they reproduced nothing of their father's qualities, were excluded from the home and denied any part in the grandeur of their noble birth. So he says these other sons, other than this one chosen son, they didn't show or reproduce anything of their father's qualities. So what he's saying is their father had good qualities. He was a virtuous man. But these sons that didn't have these qualities were excluded from the home and denied any part in the grandeur of their noble birth. So he's describing a virtuous man that had 3 wives. This is in the 1st century. This is an Israelite during so-called New Testament times. And this is the same brother again. This is Philo, and he's commenting on this law here, Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 through 14, which explain that an Israelite man can take a captive woman from a nation that is not in the land of Canaan, or that is far off from the land of Canaan, and he can take her captive if he like to and make her his wife. He's commenting on this law. What does he say? He says, and if anyone having satisfied his desire to the full and surfeited therewith is no longer minded to continue his association with the captive, the law imposes what is not so much a loss of property as an admonition and correction, leading him to improve his ways. For it bids him not to sell her, nor yet keep her as a slave, but grant her freedom, and grant her too the right to depart in security from the house, lest if another wife comes in to supersede her and quarrels ensue, as they often do, this jealousy with the master too under the sway of the charms of a new love and neglectful of the old, may bring her some fatal disaster. So he's explaining that if a man doesn't want to keep this woman as his wife, how he's supposed to treat her. And again, he's commenting on the law of Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 through 14. And you can see that within his comment, he mentions multiple wives, or the possibility and the likelihood that another wife could come in, that the husband could prefer the second wife, that quarrels could ensue, etc. So again, he's speaking about polygyny. This is a man in the first century who understands that polygyny was a part of their culture. It was lawful. It was permissible. What you see on the screen here is from the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a collection of codified oral laws that was codified around 200 Common Era by people like Yehuda Hanasi. And the purpose of it is to explain halakha. And what is halakha? Halakha means to walk, or how one would carry out specific commandments or certain laws in a practical fashion. And halakha will explain that. And so again, this was codified around 200 Common Era, and it gives us an idea of how the ancient Hebrews who lived in the first few centuries AD, as well as converts who lived within the first few centuries AD, and sometimes even before that, it gives us an idea of how they thought. As it says here, it says, in the case of one who betroths two women together with an item worth 1 peruta, so that the value of each woman's share was not worth 1 peruta, or who betroths one woman with an item worth less than 1 peruta, despite the fact that he later sent the traditional gifts of a groom to the bride, she is not betrothed because he sent the gifts on account of the first betrothal, i.e., the item whose value to the woman was less than 1 peruta, and not to affect betrothal. In other words, he didn't pay an adequate amount for the woman to be his wife or to be betrothed to him. Because as it says here, in the first sentence, it says, in the case of one who betroths two women together with an item worth 1 peruta. In other words, each woman should be having her own value of 1 peruta. You shouldn't be betrothing two with 1 peruta. So this is just another example to show you, why would they be even speaking about betrothing two women if that wasn't part of the culture, if that wasn't considered to be valid, that a man could have more than one wife. This is just another example showing you that people within the first few centuries AD within Hebraic culture understood, including the rabbis, they understood that a man having more than one wife was lawful.